Okay, I want to welcome everybody here. We're going to call the meeting to order. Welcome to the meeting 26, previously not scheduled, but due to the province's response to a request for inclusionary zoning, it's a meeting that we're having. So meeting 26 of the Planning and Growth Management Committee. Welcome to members of the committee, to the other members of council in attendance, and very much to the members of the public that are here today. For those in the room with us, the screen at the... Where's the screen? The screen in the far corner in the back of the room provides real-time updates where we're at in the agenda, which is one item today. You can follow the agenda, though, and debate on your computer, tablet, or smartphone at www.toronto.ca/council. The Planning and Growth Management Committee gratefully acknowledges it is meeting on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and home to many diverse Indigenous people. We have one item on the agenda. I have to start, though, and ask, are there any conflicts of interest?
Any declarations?
Any declarations of interest? Not seeing any. So we have one item on the agenda. We have a number of speakers on it. What I'm going to suggest is, before we get to the speakers, we have a report that our planning staff has provided for us, which is relatively hot off the press, done in remarkable time to get it here. That's why we're holding a special meeting, so we are able to, in an informed manner, consider the provincial actions and our appropriate response. I think it's most appropriate, though, with that, and it's a not too lengthy report, but a fairly substantial report, that we have our staff give us a brief presentation first as to what's in here. Then we'll go to speakers. Then we can go to questions. I turn it over to Mr. Lintern. To you or your staff going to provide the...
I believe it's Deanna Chorney and Rashid from our housing staff.
Got to speak up, Greg.
They can introduce themselves, I'm sure.
So good afternoon. My name is Deanna Chorney, and I'm with our City Planning Division, and I'm also here with my colleague Rishab Mahan. So we provided a very short overview of the key elements in the proposed regulation, as well as some of the city's concerns. And these matters are more fully discussed in the report, and certainly as part of questions, we can get into them in more detail. I think the first piece that's important to note is that the regulations are only proposed at this stage. The province has set a 45-day commenting period, which ends February 1st. So the regulations stem from Bill 7, which is the Promoting Affordable Housing Act, and that received royal assent from the province a little over a year ago in December 2016. Bill 7, if proclaimed, would amend the Planning Act to allow municipalities to implement inclusionary zoning. So turning over, so just some key features, and the regulations, or the proposed regulations, are quite dense and complex, so we just wanted to draw your attention to some of the key provisions. The first is that the regulation would enable the city to enact inclusionary zoning policies and bylaws, essentially allowing us to require affordable housing as part of new developments. The regulations provide for either significant incentives provided by the city, or that the affordable housing would be secured within a community planning permit system area, in which case no incentives would be required. And the regulation also caps the percentage of affordable housing at 10% of units within high-density transit station areas and 5% outside of those areas, as well as sets an affordability period, a maximum affordability period of between 20 and 30 years. And finally, the proposed regulation limits municipalities to only apply this requirement to condominium applications, so purpose-built rental developments are excluded. So we've raised a number of concerns and comments within the report. The first and most fundamental point that I think we want to make is that the regulations are incredibly prescriptive and really limit municipal flexibility and decision making. The second concern is that the level of incentives as proposed represents a significant financial cost to the city, and at this stage is proposed as 40% the difference between the market price and the city's affordable price. In addition, the restriction from securing purpose-built rental housing is a significant concern for us, as well as I think the exemption for purpose-built rental projects is also something we want to continue to explore with the province. I think overall, the staff's comments are that the proposed regulation is truly a missed opportunity for the city. It does not allow us to achieve real outcomes regarding housing affordability issues within our high growth areas.
So
Yeah, no, I know. We're going to get copies distributed.
you have 9, is it 9 recommendations? So what we'll do is let's hear from the public, and then maybe we'll ask staff then to go over their 9 recommendations with us. Deal with it that way. So I have a list of speakers. First is Sean Megan. Sean, you're here. There you are. So for those of you that may not have been here before, committee allows deputations of 5 minutes. We ask you to please keep it in that time. The clock's over there. And after 5 minutes, your time is up. Hopefully you'll finish by then. If there are questions of you by the committee members, they will ask you those questions, and then we'll go to the next speaker. So Sean, it's your 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'll try and be as quick as possible, although, as Deanna noted, this is a complex set of regs and there's a lot of ground to cover. My name's Sean Maher. I work at Social Planning Toronto, which does evidence-based research and public policy reform work around issues that affect vulnerable people, and housing is absolutely one of those issues. And we were very pleased, as I'm sure the city was, that the partnership between the city and the sector persuaded the provincial government last year to pass a very good piece of legislation, Bill 7, that provided for inclusionary zoning. And in fact, after an extensive consultation with the development sector, with advocates, with affordable housing providers, with municipalities, that covered all of the topics that are addressed in these regulations, reached some very wise conclusions. And one was that municipalities need to have the flexibility to design inclusionary zoning strategies that reflect their local needs, that reflect their local housing needs, that reflect their local housing markets, that reflect the economies of their local areas. So it is distressing to see a set of regulations come out on the Friday afternoon, 2 days before Christmas, that essentially reverse all of those very productive decisions, that set a 5% cap on the total amount of units or floor area that you can set aside for any new development to create affordable housing, and a 10% cap in the most richly developable areas around high-density transit developments. It's distressing to see that because it takes away the flexibility municipalities need, and it's also distressing to see that because it's anomalous in North American set-aside strategies. North American set-aside strategies are rarely that low. They tend to be appreciably higher. 20% is very common in the U.S. In over 100 municipalities, the levels are above 20%. In New York City, they are 30% and more. The right regulatory position is to have no province-wide cap, on set-asides, to have no province-wide constraints on how municipalities address this. The city recommendations address that request, but you do it kind of mildly. I would encourage the city to be very, very clear with the province that no cap should be set, not just that they respect flexibility, but they set no cap whatsoever for municipalities. Similarly, the regs ban cities from making units affordable for longer than 30 years. Why anyone would want to prevent cities from, and towns and municipalities from providing the most affordability of the greatest period of time possible, I can't imagine. Why anyone would want to kick the affordability crisis down the road to the next generation, I can't imagine. But that's what these regulations do. In U.S. jurisdictions and across North America, inclusionary zoning policies tend to have much longer affordability periods. They tend to have perpetual affordability as the increasingly common choice. And jurisdictions that had shorter affordability periods are now lengthening them through a variety of regulatory reforms. And the City of Toronto does, again, address that question in the recommendations, but again, fairly mildly. And I would encourage the city to ask the province to have no cap whatsoever in the regulations that they bring forward, not only because a cap of any kind is anathema to the municipal flexibility that you need, but also because one of the things that the province says is that the duration that they're looking at as a cap is something that they're providing because the City of Toronto asked for that cap. That may very well have been a misunderstanding, but I think it's important that the City of Toronto make it very clear to the province they do not want a cap on affordability periods. They want the flexibility to set their own caps, and they want other municipalities to have the same. The regulations also impose measures and incentives, essentially payments that taxpayers need to make to developers in order to get the developers to comply with the law and the regulation. Those are not in the legislation. They are uncommon in U.S. jurisdictions. Even in jurisdictions where they exist as a possibility, they're rarely applied. And it is bizarre that the province of Ontario would impose on municipalities the requirement that taxpayers subsidize developers especially in overheated development markets like the City of Toronto. Again, I think it's important the City of Toronto say that this is not on to the province of Ontario, in part because the province of Ontario is saying the City of Toronto asked them not to include density as a way to offset cost. And so they were forced to go to this model because the City of Toronto's request puts them in a corner. There's no evidence that we need incentives. U.S. jurisdictions don't use them. And in fact, the evidence is that when you don't have incentives, the value of those units passes back to the land costs, which tends to slow the inflation of land prices, also a benefit to housing markets in overheated contexts like the City of Toronto. I will. Let me flag one last thing in my last 5 seconds, which is that the offsite provisions that cap how much inclusionary zoning you can put on a new site are also a real challenge, and the city's recommendation on that we think is very advantageous. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Councillor Luciano?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for coming in, Sean. If you can just maybe elaborate a little bit on the comments you made with respect to New York City, that it's probably 30% of that development has affordable housing built into it. Just maybe generally elaborate on that with respect to incentives or why or how did this come about and why is it so successful there?
Yeah, so New York calls it inclusionary housing, and they approach their inclusionary housing strategy in a couple of ways. One, they recognize that there is a lot of money to be made in development in New York City, even though their development boom is a little slower than ours. There's still a lot of money to be made even in New York. And so they expect the benefit of that development to pay the cost of creating affordable housing, and they differentiate within zones, and they also differentiate in terms of outcomes. So in some cases, they say, look, this is a potentially very highly profitable, very highly dense area around transit nodes and things like that, and so we can ask for a larger percentage of the development be dedicated to affordable housing, either on-site or off-site. In other cases, they say, you know what, we're going to take a smaller percentage, but we want a deeper level of affordability. So we'll ask that you provide 10% of the units will be affordable, but they'd be much more affordable than the ones where they're asking for 30%. So New York City actually has a really robust strategy around various levels of depth of affordability, various ranges of set-asides, and that's the kind of thing that you can do if municipalities have the flexibility to design a system that responds to their housing market. What we have, unfortunately, in the regs from the province, or the draft regs from the province, is something that doesn't give you the flexibility to create a tailor-made strategy like New York has created for their very unique development environment, and it's really important that those regulations regulations get amended to give you the flexibility to design in ways that either set aside more or provide deeper affordability.
And they do all that without incentives from the municipality?
Without incentives that are costs to the public. So there are some incentives that make things work better. Fast tracking, lower parking requirements, those don't cost the taxpayer a nickel, and they do lower costs for developers, and those are sometimes attractive things to use to try and maximize the amount of affordable housing. But if you're waiving development charges or providing tax incentives or making cash payments, that's money that you don't have to provide RGI units or support rooming house availability or all the other deeper subsidy or lower cost options that inclusionary zoning won't necessarily supply. So if you want a mixed, robust housing strategy, you don't want to be using precious city dollars to subsidize developers rather than to invest in things that the market won't create.
And do those units expire in New York City after a 20, 30-year period?
I'm not sure what the duration period is in New York, but I can tell you that across the United States, perpetual is the increasingly popular choice. In some cases, they say 99 years. In some cases, they say 30 years, but they renew them cyclically, so it's 30 years renewed.
Right.
So it ends up being perpetual. And even in the jurisdictions where they used to say, like the earliest jurisdictions to adopt inclusionary zoning tended to adopt fixed periods. And they're getting to the end of those fixed periods, and they're realizing that they've manufactured an affordable housing crisis for themselves just later. And so they're shifting off of those strategies to longer term affordability and to perpetual affordability. And the province of Ontario imposing on you an environment in which you will manufacture for yourself an affordable housing crisis a generation from now makes no sense.
Yeah, that's just it. So, the units are retained by the developers as affordable? So they're not transferred to a city agency or anything like that? They're just maintained and the revenue's collected by the developer? There's
a lot of variation in the various jurisdictions that use inclusionary zoning. In a lot of cases, in order to achieve perpetual and especially perpetually affordable rental housing, there is a lot of transfer to municipal agencies or to nonprofits. Those partnerships are really valuable. If, as the current regulations tend to do, you bias the system exclusively towards ownership housing by excluding purpose-built rental, by setting up the off-site provisions so that they would exclude nonprofit housing providers, then you don't address the most important challenge in the City of Toronto's housing crisis, which is affordable rental housing. So we really do need to have that flexibility again to allow these units to be transferred to municipal agencies, to nonprofits, and to be perpetually affordable, especially in a rental housing market.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bilo.
Sean, you said that the province was saying that we had asked for the caps, right? The cap, the 30-year cap, or that some of this information was the province saying that the City of Toronto has asked for it.
Yeah, we hear this, and in fairness to everyone, we hear this in casual conversation. We don't have a formal statement from the province saying this is the City of Toronto's fault. But in casual conversation with folks at the province, what we hear back sometimes is, well, the City of Toronto said 30-year cap made sense. The City of Toronto won't let us use density bonusing.
Our submission to the legislation is public. It says quite the contrary.
Yeah.
It actually says a minimum of 20 years. So we actually asked them to set minimums, not maximums, because one of the big things that we want is the flexibility to be able to create then a bylaw that is adaptable to the different regions of the city, correct?
Absolutely, and I would encourage the City of Toronto to reinforce that message with the province of Ontario because it's not clear they fully heard it.
Okay, but you would agree that that's one of the things that we need to reinforce with the province is actually some flexibility, because even inside the City of Toronto, there's different geographic areas that would require maybe different kinds of inclusionary zoning, correct?
Yeah, and in Toronto's market, there is, like in New York's market, the possibility of creating different levels of set-asides to create different levels of affordability. You probably couldn't achieve that in Kingston, so it doesn't make sense to have the province
or every time
set
the market
rules.
changes, that we have to run to the province to have a regulation change in order to change something like that, correct?
Your bylaws are flexible enough to respond to your needs in real time, and that's the structure that makes sense for inclusionary zoning.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Perks, you had questions.
to be here today to remind you that after all the conversation around the regulations come near to a close, that the real work around inclusionary zoning will still have to happen, and that's where we come in. The partnership model is essential to meeting the goals of inclusionary zoning, and our members will be your partner in the private sector. The staff report talks about how the regulation speaks to a 40-60 split, and the work being done, if it's done outside of what I still call a development permit system, is going to require that 40% municipal contribution. Our members are that remaining 60%, and that will be the responsibility of our industry. The staff report has noted challenges with this, and I would attest to you that there'll be challenges really all around. Inclusionary zoning will be successful if there's a successful model to work with or to point to. And what I mean by this is that the mayor and people in Sean's office have already done such a really good job of providing some of these sorts of projects, which I feel your staff report might also address. And I would suggest that we have to look at these projects and ask ourselves, what happened there to help them get off the ground? Were there, as was mentioned in my previous speaker, were there ways that the development approvals were fast-tracked? What I'm suggesting is that we're going to have to kind of take a step back and look at what's going to work for Toronto and get over all the challenges that are being spoken about in many different ways. What I do want to suggest to you is that we have to find a way to make it work so that we can have a true partnership. There's always going to be a risk to these sorts of developments. There's going to be uncertainty with what the market can accept. And inclusionary zoning units, which again are really only one tool in the affordable ownership housing discussion, they're only going to be brought forward if these projects as well are successful and come forward. That's why I would suggest to you that recommendation 6 in your staff report is also important. It speaks to inclusionary zoning be tied to areas where zoning's been updated. If affordable units are to be brought on stream, it's really in our collective interest to make sure that things happen quicker, better, and faster, and this is a way to recognize that reality. So I feel as though we all have some work to do as part of this picture. The industry realizes that we're there to do this as well. The private sector already does come to the table in various ways, and we know what the responsibilities are going to be, and they will have to address your municipal policy. The private sector will take on the related administrative costs associated to the development applications and the permits, and depending on the model, they'll share in the long-term administrative costs associated to the not-for-profit housing providers for these projects. It'll also be the private sector's responsibility to invest equity and incur costs to secure construction financing for these affordable units. So what I'm trying to reinforce to you is, as your partners in community building, the development industry does have a skin in the game as well. We come to the table as your partner in community building, and a reminder that we have to collectively bring a set of balanced solutions forward so that we can be part of the creation of good policy that's in the public interest. I think we have to work with the spirit of collaboration and creative and critical thought, and understand there are limitations on both ends, from the industry side of things and from our municipal partners, and we're going to have to work together to make this work. So again, my message really today was, as soon as all the regs are done, we still are in the process of looking at them and making some comments. We're not completely done that yet as well, but recognizing that implementation is going to be key for the municipality, and that's where we commit to see how we can make it work together. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I have a question for you, and then I'll go to my colleagues. Because your comment was the developers will pay 60%, the municipality pays 40%.
So we have that responsibility in some way. This is where we come to the
so
table. We're that 60% partnership.
You have to let me ask my question.
I apologize, Councillor.
As I read the regulations, the unit would sell at market by your members at 100%. To bring it down to affordable, you have to reduce it by these regs by 40%. So the developer then sells it at a reduced cost, because we're paying 40% of the cost, or the $140,000 to bring it down. What is a contribution that the developer is making to bring the price of the unit down?
Well, I would attest to you that when we started these discussions with the province, there was always that discussion about a partnership model. And how much does the province pay? How much does the municipality pay? How much does the development industry pay? We had said we want a 50-50 split. Ideally, it'd be great if everyone came to the table together and we were responsible for that portion. I don't want to say the cost, because it does depend on the project. It depends on so many other things at play. I can't sit down to you right now and say to you, if a unit is this much, we will pay this much. That answer, we haven't figured it out. It will be a product of the municipal zoning bylaw that's created once we figure out that formula. So that's what I would suggest to you. I can't tell you exactly that it's going to be this percentage. We have to figure out how it works with everything else.
You wanted a 50-50 split as far as the cost of subsidizing the unit to bring it to an affordable rate.
We are suggesting, when we say 50-50 split, it's a partnership, in the sense that we want the municipality to come to the table and the industry.
Sorry.
I'm not talking monetary sense. Please
Sorry,
don't disregard my...
Paula, I am. I'm a simple person.
And
I try and understand things like others in the room would. My colleagues, can I deal with this one? Sorry. I've worked with your organization a lot, and I think you're aware of that. The great people come in to resolve a lot of issues we have. But I go back and say cost of a unit. Inclusionary zoning means that we wanted as a regulation the fact that the price of the unit should come down to make it affordable. We've been able to do that, and the question is whether it's rental or whatever. In this case, the cost to the municipality can be over $150,000 a unit. What's the contribution from the developer?
it would be much more than $150,000 from our end, from what we would have to secure. Absolutely.
And what about the up value that a property gets when you take it at the current zoning and the current official plan, and you upzone the property to get substantial additional density, which is based on the municipality's approval, that's going to the developer? Because a lot of that comes for some of that upzoning or that value to be put back into the unit, which is what's happened on many of the sites where we've had it, because we've negotiated these through our Affordable Housing Office and our Section 37 benefits. So that's a contribution above what was paid for the land, because there's a benefit that's been earned by the developer for the additional zoning on the site.
So let me see if I understand you. Are you asking me where Section 37 comes to play into this discussion?
Well, I'm asking you in particular how you take a building, maybe be a little bit more particular. The regs say, well, you don't have to make a parks contribution. You can offset that.
Correct.
Where do new parks come from? How do you pay for those?
Many ways for the parks to be paid for. You know that our industry can pay for those. Section 37 can be a part of that contract.
That's not. They're required to pay for it as part of the development. You have a parking standard, which we have.
Correct.
We have not a set standard per unit, but we have a variation of, it can be up to or down to, and every development comes in with a plan and decides, this is the number of parking spaces that I think work on my site. Now we're told to say, well, okay, to get affordable housing, we'll do less than that, which means we're saying people will buy units without parking because that's the way we got affordable housing. But the developer would have submitted the fact that the parking should have been there. That we take other benefits that we have and we don't do those. We don't have development charges coming towards those units. It's not a deferral, it's a contribution of. So how do you improve under this regulation? How do you improve the infrastructure of the city without the development that's going in paying for it?
Councillor Shiner, this is a conversation that is exactly to my point. This needs to be figured out. When you will see in a submission from the industry that there has to be consideration, and my colleague will speak to it, of those offsets that you're talking about. How can we look at the package inclusively and say, this is what the development industry would be paying for, these are the contributions that we already make, these are some of the items that we would like the city to consider waiving, perhaps development charges, perhaps parks, perhaps not. Perhaps let us contribute that contribution, and let's talk about bringing the projects on stream quicker. What my suggestion to you is that we are going to make this work together, but there has to also be a recognition from the municipality that it's not a free ride for anyone, and there is going to be a cost from the development industry as well. Having said that, we have never objected to inclusionary zoning or helping to bring these projects, but it can't be the sole responsibility of our industry as well. This is where I come back to the partnership discussion. So yes, there are absolutely costs with Section 37.
We'll talk
we recognize
after,
this.
because a couple of us here have a lot of experience bringing over 700 affordable housing units to the table at a much lower cost on developments, because we also act as a developer. But that's the end of my questions. Councillor Perks, did you have questions, did I see?
Yes, I did. First of all, I want to make sure I heard you clearly. Did I hear you agreeing with the city recommendation that we need the province to change what they've proposed so that local municipalities have flexibility?
What I was referring to is the recommendation, a portion of the recommendation that suggests that a way to make things happen quicker is if we look at updated zoning. So I did not make any recommendations specific to what the city should be saying to the province. Do you agree? Then if you didn't say it, I'll ask it now. Do you agree with our position that each municipality should have some flexibility? I would agree to you that Toronto is a very special place, and there has to be a recognition.
Everyone in Toronto believes.
Well, when you say the word flexibility, I have to be careful because there's going to be a framework that's set out. Could there be a framework that then we speak about that makes sense for Toronto? Perhaps. But this is where I have to say that we haven't made any formal comments on the specifics for the regulations, so I don't know what formal submission we're going to make. But absolutely.
I've got my answer. Okay. Now, I want to pursue what Councillor Shiner was saying, maybe with a little bit more specificity. My understanding is, what the provincial regulation says, is that the City of Toronto has to provide some kind of an incentive, cash or waiving a fee or whatever, that is worth 40% of the difference between what you could have sold the unit for and what we're actually getting the unit at.
Definition.
Okay.
Is that the definition of affordable? Okay. So the 60% you say you're contributing is actually not money you're spending, but rather profit you could have made and don't make. Is that correct?
No, not necessarily.
How do you mean?
I would say to you, first of all.
So if it's the difference between the definition of affordability and what the market price would have been, we agree on that?
The difference, I'm going to call it.
That's the amount of money that we would pay 40% of and you would pay 60% of.
Right.
Okay. So that difference isn't actually money that a developer spent, is it?
We can't answer that clearly. I know you'd like to be able to say A, B, C, D, it's that cut and dry. We don't know the costs associated
Laws have to work like that. People have to understand how the laws work. So this is what they're proposing.
This is dependent on the projects. If you want to simplify it in that term, we have to look at the formula, what it makes sense for the city. We haven't done the math. We haven't had one of our members, perhaps they have on their own accord. In our exercise yet, as we're preparing to respond to the regulations, we haven't done the formula. We've looked at the framework.
Yes.
We say that what you're speaking to is one part of it.
Yes.
There's another part of it where none of this applies to if you're dealing with a community permit system. So
Okay,
we're looking at the front, and we're looking at it all together holistically.
Okay? So
I don't want to sit here and debate to the formula and the yays or the nays. My submission to you is that when we're ready, we're here to work with you to figure it out.
and I appreciate that, and thank you for that. But you did make a claim. You did make a claim during your deputation.
Fair enough.
That you're being asked, your members are being asked to provide something. Right?
I'm saying
and that's
that we will
something
be
you called 60%. Right, is actually not money your members would spend, but profit they might have made that they didn't wind up making.
I would suggest to you that it's the contribution in whichever form it's going to be. I don't want to use that word profit. This is not what we're hearing.
I imagine you don't.
And I imagine this is what you are asking me to say. If I'm suggesting to you that we are going to be your partner and make things happen, just as though many developers already have, there are units that we can point to where it makes sense. I'm not going to suggest to you that we can play with the price. The market's going to bear what the market can bear. There's going to be stress tests in every direction that we look at. So let's figure this out together as we move forward for the city. Let's not make the industry an adversarial here when we've said we're going to pay our fair share. Let's figure it out together as we move along.
So on that, I just want to, you just used the word pay. I have an idea. I know when I go to the store and I pay for something, I actually pull money out of my wallet and give it to somebody. In this formula, as I understand it, your members are not being asked to pull money out of their wallets and give it to somebody, but rather they're being asked to, for a certain number of the units that they build, not make profit.
Would they have
instead get cash from us?
Would they have to be paying for the development fees that are associated to it, the development charges that are associated to it, any other funds. There are payments made that go into a unit that the developer pays.
Okay.
So if we're playing with semantics of
think I
a
have
word
my
that I
answer.
used,
Sorry, but under our semantics, but under this proposal, you don't pay development charges, you don't pay fees, you don't pay for parks, and you don't provide your parking. So a developer pays what?
through you,
Always.
Counselor. When we look at the cost of a home, those are the payments in general. This is what I'm referring to. The cost of a unit. There are various contributors that go into it. There are things that are being looked at to be subsidized, yes. Those will be offsites. But there is going to be a payment for us to bring these units to market. There are payments, whichever way you want to word it. There's contributions that the industry is going to be making. We build these units. They're only going to be sold if the market absorbs them. Everyone has a cost associated to this.
Councillor DeCiano had questions. My
Thank you,
apologies,
Mr.
member,
Chair.
for clarification.
So I think at this point, I'm going to respectfully disagree with my colleague, Councillor Perks, but only until I get a little bit of clarification. So let's imagine that a three-bedroom condo today is worth $700,000. And the definition of the affordable ownership price is $300,000. It's a $400,000 difference. So the legislation right now assumes that the city, through different means that the legislation provides us, will make up 40% of the difference, and the rest is on the developer to make up the difference. Is that how you read the legislation? You're paying 60% of the difference between the market price and the affordable ownership price.
I'm afraid to say yes. I'm afraid to say difference, only because I feel
No,
as
I think it's yes.
We're really friendly people.
Yeah.
Don't be
I
afraid.
No,
feel
Paul,
as though-
and the reason why
it might be turned around.
the reason why I respectfully disagree with Councillor Perks on this, and he knows how I feel about developers paying their fair share, is because as profitable as the industry is, there isn't $400,000 profit in a condo unit.
Correct.
So you are actually putting out substantial money from the cost that it costs you to build the condo.
I would say correct.
Okay. So you are foregoing some of your profits, but you're certainly paying into it.
Yeah.
Is that the way you see it? Because that's the way I see it. Because I know you're not making that kind of profit on a unit.
There is going to be costs that are incurred to the industry.
Okay.
To bring these units forward, bottom line.
Okay. So thank you for that. That's all my questions.
Councillor Barlow, did you have questions?
Ms. Tenuta, you would agree that for this legislation to work, the municipalities and the industry, this needs to work for both. You need to produce the units. We need to create a legislation that doesn't hinder the industry, but so that you can continue to construct, because that's the only way we're going to get units if you continue to produce and to build in the city,
buildings and the
correct?
units, correct.
So what we really need to look at the issue is look at this issue the same way that you, developers, look at it, which is looking at the pro forma, correct?
Absolutely.
A builder looks at the pro forma and says, does this make sense? Can I get my money out of it? Yes, okay, I'm going to build. So we need to create a legislation and to understand what is the soft spot that you will continue to build and we are able to be a partner that it's going to be making sense, that it makes sense to create that legislation, correct?
Yes, I would say, go ahead.
So if I tell you that we had people looking at this, that do this for a living, and that have come back to us with numbers very, very different that do not include a 40% contribution from the city, which is a big concern that we have with the legislation, aside from the caps that we really like the minimums because we want that flexibility. The other is the cost that it's going to translate the way that these regulations are written. So if we have a pro forma that works, that does not require us to come with 40% of this cost, but actually shows you scenario after scenario that it can work for the industry, do you think that the industry would still be available to have the conversation with us?
I strongly do, because as I was trying to say, that there are other tools to be used as well. There
So
are
maybe
projects
both
that
our
exist.
definitions should be to the province to look at those kinds of performers, because 40% is not working for us, because we can't pay $150,000. Otherwise, we would just create an investment in affordable housing program like the province and the federal government have anyways, because that's what it is. Why don't we actually look at the economics of these issues and create something that works for municipalities so that we can create legislation and allow it to create legislations and allows the industry to continue to produce and to flourish and to develop.
I think if it's going to work, we have to find something that works for the both of us. Otherwise, to your point, these units will not be built. The market is not going to accept it, and it's not going to put you in a position or us in a position to bring anything forward together. So do we need to find something that works for the city? Yes. That's why I did say, after all these EBR consultations are done, we have to hammer it down. You're going to be creating bylaws. You're going to be doing all the calculations. There are already projects in the city that have worked. Back to my point here, why did they work here in Toronto? Were there other things that made them happen? Were there fast tracks on permits? Perhaps that was enough. There are going to be circumstances that are going to work for the City of Toronto. And if we are your partner, then it has to be successful for both.
Thank you. With the committee's permission, I'm just going to go to a second round so I can get some clarification, because you say work as a partner, and I think, Paula, you know that I want to, but currently we don't forego development charges. We defer them.
Correct.
And we collect them at the time that the unit may become an at-market unit. So they're deferred out for a long time. We don't have that cost. We don't have to. If we have to forego that, how do we do the capital improvements that those development charges are supposed to pay for? Go to the second part, planning fees.
Correct.
You'd like me to fast track, but if I have to give up the planning fees in the application, I have to reduce my staff, because by legislation, I'm only permitted to have the staff that we pay for the staff from the fees that we charge, which have to be commensurate to each other, and we've been challenged by that by the industry for charging too much.
Yes.
So I can't fast track, I'm going to slow track you, because I don't have staff to get anything in them. Things will get worse. Parks contributions aren't just grass. They're often used for infrastructure that has to go into place, or repair of that infrastructure, their improvements. If we don't have that, we can't improve it for the intensification. And parking reductions are based really, the standards we set, but every development has industry folks tell us what's right, and if we reduce that, people that buy units have nowhere to park. So what our report says, we could be talking $158,000 a unit or $158 million annually. How can the municipality expect to partner and pay that and find this as a successful program, which it's not necessarily your recommendation. This is based on the provincial regulations. So I guess my question is, do you think that we could survive with that type of input or cost per unit and giving up all those things? Or do you believe that we should work at this together to find a better compromise where affordable housing units can actually be built, because this regs, in our opinion, won't work?
Councillor, you bring up very valid points. That's why in my comments I was clear to say there are challenges. for the municipality, and we recognize those challenges. There will be challenges as well for us to bring these markets to unit. They need to be sold. To Councillor Bilau's point, they need to be built. There's cost for our industry, there's cost for the municipality. We have to find a way to have creative solutions to make it work. I can't answer you as to where you're going to get the revenue from these other sources if the city decides to follow that part of the model. There are other parts of the model you can flow to. There are other options for you as well. It's a package suite.
The only other option was a community permit system, right?
That is part of the package, yes.
Okay, and that was formerly known as the development permit system.
Correct.
And we brought one forward, and Bill, along with others, appealed that to the Ontario Municipal Board because you didn't want us to have one.
We did, and since you
So,
brought that up, may I?
from that perspective, from your perspective, that's not a starting point.
Well, I would
Because
suggest...
we shouldn't have one. Your organization said, we don't think you should have one. We appealed it, and now we're in judicial court fighting over what the board did. So, in due respect, that's a red herring that the province said the city could do because it's not doable now. We can't have a DPS. We won't have a DPS for years.
We can.
It just won't happen. And affordable housing is needed, and regulations are needed now.
Councillor,
Yes.
we are on record that we do support a development permit system.
Just
We did
not
not, no, not at all. We did not object to it from the beginning. We didn't object to it from the city. If we do look at the reasons for our appeal, we suggested that perhaps it was too soon, too fast. The OMB decision came down. The OMB decision said all the city of Toronto had to do was create a bylaw. We were fine with that. We could have ended the conversation there, and then we were taken to divisional court. So I would suggest
We're completely off track, and unfortunately, Paul, you seem to misrepresent it because we've challenged that in the courts because we have never prepared a bylaw before, and we believe that although the OMB was off on developments as they approved it before, as such major changes have come in the Planning Act, we believe they are way off now. So maybe we'll just stop it there, and I'll go to the next speaker. But I really do appreciate if we're going to bring things up, it's things that we can agree upon, not totally different perspectives.
Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you. Michael Collins Williams, I'm sorry, Director of Policy, OHBA.
Good afternoon. My name is Mike Collins Williams, and I'm the Director of Policy for the Ontario Home Builders Association. OHBA represents 4,000 member companies organized into a network of 29 associations across Ontario, with our largest here in Toronto, known as BUILD, whom you just heard from. I'd like to open with a quote by Michael Shapcott, formerly with the Wellesley Institute and co-chair of the Housing Network of Ontario, on March 24th, 2011 at the Standing Committee at Queen's Park. Quote, "We've developed case studies of inclusionary zoning policies that are successfully used in hundreds of U.S. cities. One of the keys, and this addresses specifically the issue that the home builders raise, is that of course you don't want to have a mechanism that actually takes the profit out of home development, because then there won't be home development. What you do is develop a mechanism that ensures the developers make a profit, and the U.S. ones do, and at the same time ensures a healthy mix of housing." End quote. With this in mind, I'm sure the committee will recognize that there's no such thing as affordable concrete, affordable lumber, or affordable labor. The reality is that all of these inputs towards housing come at a real cost. Inclusionary zoning is not a silver bullet that creates affordable housing out of thin air. It is a planning tool that, if structured properly in a partnership model, can deliver new affordable housing. I'd like to cite academic research on inclusionary zoning programs in the United States. Under IZ, there needs to be measures and offsets to ensure economic viability of projects and to ensure that we don't shift the cost burden to middle-income buyers through cross-subsidization. A July 2016 study by the Urban Lands Institute found that almost all cities in the United States offer various types of incentives to offset the economic impacts, and that inclusionary zonings depend on the market rate development to be successful. Quote, "Jurisdictions will need to provide development incentives to ensure the feasibility of development projects affected by an IZ policy. The principal incentives are direct subsidies, density bonuses, tax abatements, and reduced parking requirements. Individually and in combination, these incentives can substantially enhance the feasibility of development projects affected by an IZ policy." End quote. I've brought copies of that report, and I'm happy to leave it behind with committee members as well as a number of other academic reports. Here are some examples of measures and offsets. Arlington County, Boston, and most areas in California provide density bonuses. In Fairfax County, which is just outside of Washington, developers can actually have unlimited floor area ratio density with provisions of affordable housing units if they're within half mile of a transit station. Denver gives a $5,000 per unit cash subsidy, reduced parking, expedited review, and a 10% density bonus. Sacramento waives fees, expedites reviews, provides gap financing, and gives a 25% density bonus. The most comprehensive example is New York, which you heard some details from earlier. I will add to that in that New York has a voluntary inclusionary program with significant density bonuses combined with tax incentives in exchange for building affordable units. New York is currently implementing a mandatory inclusionary program in just 7 geographic areas that combines the affordability component with a significant upzoning of these areas. Ontario municipalities, however, have a very different planning framework where zoning is not often in conformity with provincial policy. Properties are typically underzoned, meaning virtually every project requires a long political process through rezoning. By contrast, in New York, developments are done as of right, meaning there's no political process for over 90% of projects, including the massive skyscrapers you see going up in Manhattan. Its air rights there are simple mathematical calculation to obtain permits, and there's no negotiation or rezoning discussion. Skyscrapers are allocated a certain amount of density, and the inclusion of affordable units results in a specific density bonus. It's a simple mathematical equation. New York also offers a 421A tax exemption, which offers property tax exemptions for up to 20 or 25 years for new rental buildings with affordable housing. Not just for the affordable units, but also for all of the market units, they also receive that property tax exemption. Tax credits such as the federal low-income housing tax credit can also be utilized in combination with the inclusionary zoning projects. This kind of framework was referred to in a November 2015 Standing Committee presentation at Queen's Park, where the Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada noted of inclusionary zoning programs in the United States. That model uses a set of cost offsets, density bonusing, reduced development charges, and fast tracking in order to make sure the development industry still retains the capacity to be a viable business. It is imperative that we work in partnership to leverage planning and financial tools that would facilitate the creation of government-mandated affordable housing units without compromising the health and affordability of the broader housing market. I'm just about out of time. I've got 2 sentences left. We believe that the IZ tool can be used in a partnership model. The reality is, when it comes to the objective of building thousands and thousands of affordable units, is it will require a more robust framework where inclusionary zoning is but one of many tools and programs where significant government funding is injected into the construction of new affordable housing.
Thanks, Michael. You have to stay within the time if you can. There are people with questions. Councillor DiCiano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Collins-Williams, for coming in. So I'll ask you just if you can elaborate again on some of the differences with respect to how it works in New York City from a planning perspective and a zoning perspective and a tax incentive perspective, because I was under the impression there aren't many incentives given to developers in New York City.
So there's a combination of things that they have available at the state level. The 421A tax exemptions provided through New York State.
Sorry, the what?
It's called the I can leave, I've got some research on it, so I'm happy to leave more details and numbers on how that actually functions.
Okay.
But essentially, it's a tax exemption that offers property tax relief to developers and owners of rental condominium buildings. Developers can qualify for the exemption if they provide 20% of the units as on-site affordable housing, and the exemptions will last 20 or 25 years. And it's been used in the voluntary program where a lot of developers have voluntarily come to the table to build the affordable units, because the tax exemptions apply not just to the affordable units, but also all of the market units in the building.
So they're getting a tax exemption on the property taxes of the entire building?
Of the entire building for rental projects.
So I would assume that these rental projects are, well, they're all rental. There's no mix of ownership and rental in these houses, in these towers?
So as I said at the beginning, New York has a variety of different incentives. Okay. So with the property tax one, it's geared towards the owners of the rental buildings. Federally, there's a low-income housing tax credit that builders of both ownership or rental can tap into. And then, as I said earlier, that the density bonuses in New York are significant, but they have a different system where most development is approved as of right. So a developer doesn't have to come in with a rezoning, go through the planning department, go through a political process. It's essentially a mathematical equation of what the density allowances are that you're allowed. You pull your permit and you go to build. But if you reach certain affordability thresholds, you get a bump up in your density, and it's just automatic. So that's where you see some of the very tall towers going up in Midtown Manhattan. What they do is they provide affordable units either on-site or off-site. They get a bonus, and then they're also able to transfer density from sites around them. So developers are creative in New York in being able to amass different density through different measures or offsets, be it affordable housing, and then there are also some other ways in which they can acquire different density.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Barlow, questions?
So you mentioned that it was the state that actually paid for that incentive in New York, is that correct?
The measure is through the state, but the property taxes go to the city. So it's somewhat similar to here in that we're talking about a provincial regulation that sets the framework. It's a state tax exemption, so it's used for inclusionary housing in New York City.
Tax exemption?
It comes through Albany, it's through the state.
So that's one of the things that I think it's interesting in this legislation. It's a partnership just between the two of us, the city and the industry. The province is great at writing stuff, but not so great at writing checks, I guess.
In our original submission to the province, we had recommended that the province could play a role through reductions in land transfer tax to also come to the table through a partnership.
I guess they didn't listen to you either.
They did not.
No. Okay.
Thank you. I have a question for you then. You're talking about regulations in areas like New York and other ones through the states. And then those municipalities, they don't follow the same regulatory system as Ontario, where although we may set a zoning and then we set an official plan, and we could quite clearly allow easily an amendment to the zoning to meet the official plan is quite easy. Most applications now are amendments to the official plan. But we don't have the last word. The last word on the official plan rests with appeals at the provincial level. So I would then suggest that you'd be supportive of getting rid of that and leaving all of the zoning matters and official plan matters at the municipal level. And then we could enact legislation that we know would be final.
I think our members would always like the avenue of appeal in terms of bringing the zoning into conformity with the official plan. That is something at a broader public policy level that we've supported. The province just passed a new growth plan which sets different density targets for urban growth centers. Municipalities will now be required to have different density targets around major transit station areas to be delineated in the official plan, and we'd certainly recommend that the zoning be updated to match those density targets.
Well, in the municipality like us, we don't do the zoning first, we do the official plan. And we are very cognizant of the zoning, and I don't know any application that I can remember where someone asked for the zoning to increase to meet the official plan, and the city wasn't supportive of that. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the fact that our official plan has continually been applications to amend that, and that's what's appealed to the province, and that becomes an issue. And as far as the growth targets, we've met or exceeded. We are vastly exceeding any of the provincial growth targets that are out there. So we don't have the same ability, the bottom line is, do we, as New York or other American to actually set the limits on development, because those we are all appealable to the province, and that's the way the system's gone for a long time. So my question, I guess, is in comparing us to them, are you not comparing apples to oranges when it comes to regulatory approval?
Somewhat, and that's why I raised some of the issues around the density bonuses. I think a lot of groups have suggested that density would be the fair trade-off for affordable units. I compare and contrast the density bonuses that are given in New York and in California in that That might not be the appropriate trade-off here in Ontario because we do have a different system. They have a system there in which many of the density permissions are granted as of right, where we tend to have a system here where applicants will come in with proposals that may meet the provincial policy statement, may meet the growth plan, and may in fact meet the official plan, but have to apply for official plan amendments or zoning bylaw amendments to bring the zoning into conformity with provincial policy.
Sorry, you said they would meet the official plan, but have to have an application to vary the official plan.
In some cases, if they don't meet the official plan, they would have an application. And in other cases, where they do meet the official plan, they would just be applying for a zoning bylaw amendment. My comparing and contrasting was that in New York City, with the density that they have built in, that they just pull a permit based on the density. Our system here is a longer, drawn-out planning system where there's a lack of certainty, and in other jurisdictions, there's often more certainty.
I think we all agree with you 100% on that. Thank you. It is a very long, drawn-out system where the municipalities don't have the jurisdiction to be able to make the final decisions. That's been well documented. Thank you. And that's probably the reason why the province had to amend the Planning Act and the roles of the Ontario Municipal Board because of the way the pendulum has swung. Donna Borden, thank you for coming. Sorry, I see someone moving. Is someone here from Acorn, or Donna's not here? I'll move on. Joy Connolly, Homecoming Community Choice Coalition. I got an echo over here. I don't know if you guys hear it in the room there. No, our tech guys, there's an echo coming up. And it's not my hearing aids because I don't wear any. Yes, Joy, please, we're here to listen to you.
Thank you. So thank you for the opportunity to speak. Sean Maher spoke my mind, but let me use my 5 minutes to bring another perspective, a human rights perspective, to the discussion. I'm a member of the Homecoming Coalition, a human rights organization dedicated to ensuring planning practices promote inclusion, not exclusion. I think many of us talk about housing as a human right. The federal government's new national housing strategy affirms that housing rights are human rights. But what does it mean in practice? I think the Ontario government offered a very good example back in March 2016 when it introduced this legislation. Great idea, one that's been proven effective in over 800 jurisdictions in the US, and something Toronto has been asking for. So what a disappointment that the draft regulations that should be supporting the legislation are actually undermining it. You've heard the problems for others. I'm not going to repeat them. Instead, I want to talk about how exclusionary the proposed regulations are. Last month, Build published the benchmark price for a new condominium in Toronto, $702,000, up a staggering 43% from the November 2016 benchmark price of $493,000. Who can afford that? The 2016 census tells us the wealthiest 19% of Toronto households who own more than $150,000 per year, and most of them already own homes. Under the current regs, a measly 5% of the units in new buildings would be reserved for the rest of us, the 81% of Torontonians who couldn't afford these prices. And as for tenants who know they can never save money, enough money for a down payment, these regs offer them nothing at all. This is not inclusion. What would a truly inclusionary zoning regulation look like? Well, they could start by recognizing that cities have a role in ensuring that people of all incomes are included. We can't just rely on new supply to bring down prices. We need the right sort of supply to genuinely meet the needs of the people who call or want to call Toronto home. Second, they should return to the origins of the Ontario government's own legislation, starting with the private members' bill sponsored by MPP Peter Milchin. At the time, Milchin said his bill, quote, aims to restore local decision-making. So, Ontario government, this is your #1 ask. And then, City Council, it's up to you. You don't have to start from scratch. Your staff have access to reports, studies, policies from 800 jurisdictions in the United States. I do agree with Bill that this is a collaborative process. In the U.S., municipalities have worked hard to identify the sweet spot that will work in their markets. And I have a great example from San Francisco if anyone wants to ask me about it. It's just not a pick a number out of the air exercise, 5%, 10%, 20%. It does involve looking carefully at the economics, how to sustain growth while still promoting inclusion. But it also involves looking at the city's interests from many angles. Angles such as how can our children continue to live in the city where they grew up? Are the people who take care of our children, clean our hospitals, serve us coffee, able to live in the city they serve? One more thing. As has been mentioned before, inclusionary zoning is just one tool. It works in hot markets like Toronto, and boy, oh boy, I don't want to wait a long time for this to happen because we have a hot market right now. But there are other things Toronto can do and is doing. So streamlining the approvals of new shelters across the city, great initiative, well done. Preserving affordable housing we have now by extending rental replacement provisions on dwelling rooms, not just dwelling units, brilliant. Rooming houses, the most affordable housing we have, it's the next frontier. Taking a hard look at the yellow belt that lets houses get bigger and bigger but doesn't even allow duplexes. So fight for inclusionary regs that promote an inclusive Toronto, and then do what you can with your own policies to make Toronto a good home for all. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions of the Deputy? Councillor Perks.
What the heck is going on in San Francisco?
I'm glad you asked. To me, what was interesting about this, it was an iterative process where there was genuine collaboration between the development industry and in there, it's the mayor's housing office. It's so crucial to the city's well-being that they've brought it right in and gave it a central profile. And labor, citizens groups, advocates, and so forth. So they started out 2006, 10% affordable units on site, and then a provision, or 20% if you wanted fees in lieu, instead of putting the housing on site. In 2012, they created this big tent group, settled on 12% affordable if on site, 20% if fees in lieu. So they were generating about 1,000 to 2,000 affordable units per year, mostly through fees, but also in on-site development. 2016, they looked again and they realized that there was actually still room to be able to do some negotiation. 14% on site, 23% in lieu. And then here's the cautionary note on the other side. There are council members who said, you know what, this is not good enough. We want 18% on site, 30% in lieu. And when they did that, they went from generating 1,000, 1,500 units per year to none. Development stopped dead. So there was a sweet spot, 10% too low, 30% too high. And they were able to find that collaborative, that spot that made the best deal for the city as well as for developers.
So what that suggests to me, and I want to see if I'm learning properly from your example, is that rather than have the province set province-wide numbers and just say, this is how it's going to be, and any change in it would therefore require a regulatory change, and we all know how quick that goes. We should instead allow municipalities to have flexibility so they can establish a process like the one you described and constantly be revising to match existing circumstances. Is that a fair interpretation of what you just tried to teach me?
It's precisely right. This limit, a cap of 5%, you're leaving stuff on the ground. And yet there are other places where 0 is the right number. And so you need to have the flexibility to meet differences in your own jurisdiction, never mind, Sudbury.
Thanks for teaching me yet again, Joy.
Thank you. I don't see other questions of you. Thank you very much for coming. I've got Joanna Moon. Is Joanna here? Here's Joanna, and after Joanna is Daryl Chong. And if any of you haven't found the report online or want a copy of the staff report, there are still some on the table over there. Joanna, your 5 minutes is with you.
Thank you. So hello, members of the Planning and Growth Management Committee, including my own city councilor, Anna Bailau. Thank you for allowing me to speak today. My name is Joanna Moon, and I'm a community worker at the Dale Ministries in Parkdale. The Dale is a faith-based organization with a long history in the Parkdale neighborhood. We welcome all people, especially those who are marginalized, into full participation in the life of the community. We do not have a building of our own, but run all of our drop-ins and outreach programming in partnership with other community organizations. At the Dale, most of our friends are low income and many are underhoused. Over the last number of years, it has become increasingly difficult to find affordable, suitable housing within Parkdale, and some of our friends have been forced out of the neighborhood in order to be housed. One friend found housing in Scarborough and would walk 3+ hours back to Parkdale to come to the Dale and other communities that he called home. I am here today on behalf of myself, my community, and my coworkers Aaron Oxford and Megan Gillard to express our concern about the regulations surrounding the recently proposed policy tool for implementing inclusionary zoning. We are encouraged that inclusionary zoning has been put on the table, and we feel that the proposed regulations severely hamper the possibility of real change in the amount of affordable housing in Toronto, and particularly in Parkdale. Specifically, as has been mentioned, and I know you feel similarly, we believe that a 5% maximum is too low for the percentage of affordable units that a municipality can require of developers. Also, given that the vast majority of our friends in Parkdale are renters, the fact that the proposed inclusionary zoning does not apply to rental developments means that it almost certainly will not benefit these friends who are in the lowest income bracket and are clearly not in a position to buy a condo. We recognize that development is somewhat inevitable, and we strongly believe that development does not need to lead to displacement. If inclusionary zoning was made to apply to rental developments, and the percentage of affordable units is raised to 20% or the cap is removed, as has been mentioned today, my friends may stand a chance of staying in the diverse and lively village that is Parkdale. A deputation was read on behalf of the Dale at a committee meeting on November 14th, 2017, with regards to the luxury condo development at King and Dufferin. If this had been a rental development and strong inclusionary zoning had been in place before this development was approved, more than 100 of my friends in Parkdale could have been in the running for an affordable unit. Can you imagine if the 100+ people that come to the Dale's community meal every Monday were told that they could have an affordable, high-quality housing option right in their beloved neighborhood? This dream could become a reality if you choose to implement inclusionary zoning that includes rental developments and removes the cap on affordable units. That would be an incredible legacy to leave. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Not seeing any. Thank you very much for coming. Daryl Chung. I saw you before, Daryl. 2 days in a row, Daryl.
Good afternoon. It's like deja vu. Most of the people here saw my slide presentation from yesterday, so I apologize if you've already seen this. I'm Daryl with the Greater Toronto Apartment Association. We're an association of apartment building owners and managers. The members have about 150,000 units of purpose-built rental in the GTA, most of those in the city of Toronto. This one. Sorry. Anyway, this is just a snapshot of CMHC's most recent publication, which is October 2017. It just shows the average rents by bedroom count. Bachelors, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, and 3 bedroom. Private sector apartment owners currently provide most of the affordable housing in the city of Toronto. This something you saw yesterday. This is the city stat sheet on how the city grows. It lists the number of rental units that came online by year for the last 7 or 8 years. It's an average of 1,200 units a year of purpose-built rental. And this is, again, you saw this yesterday if you were there. This is a longer sheet that shows the last 20 years of openings of purpose-built rental in the city of Toronto, averaged out at about 830 units a year. So I guess the point is, we don't build very many of them. We'd like to build more of them. It really has to do with economics. The current situation is, it doesn't make financial sense to go forward. Any additional strain to the pro forma will put more of these potential prospective buildings on hold or canceled. Yesterday I was speaking about increased DCs in a magnitude of doubling, and my fear is that with that size of an increase on a per door basis, a lot of the stuff in the proposal pipeline will evaporate. Again, we already provide most of the affordable housing in the city. This is something that we've been doing for a long time. It's not something that we're afraid of. Most of our buildings, lots of our buildings are entirely affordable by the definitions used by the city and CMHC. Depends on where you are in town, which neighborhood, which pocket. But the only way we get more rental is by being less prescriptive, reducing the financial, increasing the financial incentives to make it happen. This and the DCs and all the other things don't do any of that. However, the city's open door program.
But Daryl, then please talk to inclusionary zoning.
Yeah, so.
Yesterday was development charges, today is a different topic.
Right. In regards to inclusionary zoning, the provincial reg, Bill 7, exempts purpose-built rental from inclusionary zoning. And I read the report that was just published yesterday, the one before this committee, and it's recommending that the city submit a letter to the province requesting that that exemption be removed. Our feeling is that the province included that exemption because they didn't want to do anything to reduce the precious few new purpose-built rental units that we create each year. They know that this will have an effect, a negative effect on the pro forma, and would cause cancellations of projects. So what I'm speaking about is, we can speak about inclusionary zoning in isolation, which I'll try to do, but it's part of a bigger picture. The open door program that the city initiated just a year ago is successful. It's in its infancy, but I think it's growing. I think with the right further incentives, we can make that sort of the prototype to create more affordable housing. The simple request is that, as Michael from the Ontario Home Builders mentioned, there are certain opt-in programs that the City of New York has used successfully. My recommendation, or the industry's recommendation, is you create an opt-in for purpose-built rental. It's something that's done sort of as an expansion of the open door policy, but not something that's prescriptive that will kill any or some of the projects that might be in the pipeline. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. Councillor Perks has questions.
Yeah. First of all, I just want to ask a question about this chart. I've seen you show it before.
Yeah, yes, sir.
And your point is that for some reason we're not building rental. I'm curious why you picked the year 1997.
Oh, it's 20 years.
That's 20 years. Well, coincidentally, it's also the year that Mike Harris repealed the Rent Control Act and replaced it with the Tenant Protection Act, and said that any rental building built after 1991 was not subject to rent control. So all of the units built there were built without rent control provisions, correct?
Actually, it was Bob Ray in 1991 that made the exemption, and it was supposed to be a 5-year pilot.
That's right, and Harris made it.
And then Harris just said, just leave it.
That's correct, yes. So I'm correct that all of the units you're describing here were built when the owners knew that they would not have rent control?
Correct.
Okay. So if the thing stopping you from building wasn't rent control, and it's certainly not the lack of demand for housing, because there's a lot of demand for housing, and it's certainly not the fact that the City of Toronto makes it impossible to build anything, because we're building enough to accommodate, I think it's 40,000 new residents in the City of Toronto every year. What's the thing that's stopping you?
It's a combination of all of those things and the other costs that make it financially basically unviable to build new rental.
Maybe I can be more precise. Why is it that the condo guys are building like gangbusters and you're not?
So
what's the difference?
The costs are about the same. You know, if you're going to build a condo versus an apartment, identical in terms of height and density and all that. Purchasing of the land's the same.
Yep.
Hard costs and soft costs for construction are relatively the same. It's the business model. So in a for-sale product, 70% of the units are pre-sold at a set price. The developer knows what they're going to get upon completion. They can reverse engineer the math. They know what they need per square foot. Our costs to build per square foot are the same. When we look at that versus what we need to take construction financing, we don't pre-sell anything. So the developer basically goes to a lending institution and says, I need money to buy the land. Then I need money for construction financing, draw from that, and then pay off like a traditional 30-year mortgage once the building's open and substantially filled. We don't think we can generate enough in rent per square foot to make that happen.
Okay.
So we don't build them in most cases.
So if I heard you, it's not that it costs more to build rental, it's not that the soft costs are higher, it's not that the land costs are different, it's that you're competing against guys who, by law, have a way to walk in, build the thing, pay it off, and walk away with a profit.
No, we're not competing against anyone. We're competing against.
You're like when you're buying land. Like if I'm a rental builder, I'm looking to buy a piece of land, right? I have a business model and I need a certain return. The other guy bidding on that land has a business model that gets him a better return faster, so he can afford to pay more for the land and pushes me out.
No, I understand.
Is that a fair way to put it?
No, so the example, one of my colleagues appeared before the committee yesterday, and I think he presented and left his spreadsheet for you to analyze. That's an example of a project, or two projects, by one developer, where the land is infill. They're putting land in at zero cost. They didn't compete with anyone to buy this land. Those slim margins are when the land is free. And they still couldn't, they could just barely make it work. But with the doubling of the DCs, it's neither project's going to go forward.
No,
so
I
with a
understand
10% set aside.
I understand all of that, but there are people who are making money buying land and building housing in the city of Toronto. And I think what I heard you say at the start is their business model is gets a better return than the business model of a guy doing rental.
No,
I think I heard you say almost exactly those words.
I think I said their business model is different. And in our business model, when we take all those combined costs, land, construction, everything, put them all together, we get a density and height. We know how many units we can build. We divide that by square footage.
I understand.
So we just can't make that number work.
But condo guys can.
Apparently.
Okay.
It's a different model. They're selling it. They don't need to hold on to a property for 40 years to pay down a mortgage.
Okay. So if my goal is to get the private capital building rental, my task is now to figure out why the condo guys can make money and you can't.
I don't know the answer to that question. That is.
I think I understand. Thank you.
So I'm going to follow down. Daryl, you have a rental building. You construct it, you finance it, you want your return on your investment. You set your rates to get your return on investment. That's what you have. And the financing model is the one you explained, correct?
Basically, yes.
You go to build a condominium building, you design it, and then you sell it, and then you build it, and you've got your built-in profit, and you walk away from it. And then the question comes to how can the people buying the units then afford to buy them and rent them and make a profit? So am I correct in my assumption that I may buy that unit for $500,000 and I may put a deposit down on it, which is a portion of that as an investment, finance the rest, I cover my financing costs from the rent, and I have the capital gain on my investment. So I'm making money because I only put 25% down, and that unit is appreciating, and the rest of the costs are covered by the renter. So I am making a cash investment, but I can sell that later and get my capital gains at a market rate. Am I right? But my apartment unit, I can only sell based on the revenue that I'm getting. And if my revenue doesn't go up, even though it may cost more to replace it, I can only sell it based on the revenue that I'm getting, because that's a different type of investment.
An apartment building is a very different type of investment. It's a very long-term hold. It's very capital intensive and labor intensive, and you can't sell off one unit or a floor at a time. It's all or none.
But when you sell it, it's the building, is the building not valued based on the revenue it's returning?
Usually that's how it would be evaluated. It's basically cash flow. A combination of things, but cash flow is very important in any business that you want to sell. And that would be based on, the cash flow is based on rent, monthly rent, annual rent.
Second part of the question.
But the thing is, there's also a cap on rental increases in Ontario, post 91. So it's not like any other business where you can raise costs or you can raise your revenue based on, to cover off your expenses that increase. This one has ever increasing expenses, but there is some containment of income based on the rent guideline.
Well, I don't want to get into that debate,
no, you don't
whether you cover it or not.
It's a different
That's a different debate. The second part is you said that you're exempt from this legislation.
It's not included at the moment.
Do you want to be included or not included in it?
No, we don't want to be included. Anything that's prescriptive.
Well, let me ask you the question then. The intention with inclusionary zoning is so we have a policy where we can actually have affordable housing units built in, or rental units built into it, and have policies that will be in place to help reduce the cost of those units, even if it was 10% of a rental building. So those 10% of the buildings would be at a lower rent than the market rent. So I don't understand why you don't want to be part of the flow and have those benefits.
That's exactly what the Open Door Initiative is. We already have a program in place that's pretty new, where you can apply for affordable and build affordable rental units and get incentives from the city in terms of a walk from DC, property tax and things like that. I think if you were to take that relatively new program and expand it, we could create more units if for projects where the owner of or the developer could opt into them instead of being overly prescriptive, which may have the unintended consequence of chasing away projects. I think
do you think we can maintain those programs if we're stuck putting $154,000 into a unit?
I don't know.
Or $154 million annually into affordable housing through the provincial legislation?
I don't know what the numbers look like on.
That's what's in the report. 154,000 a unit up to, and 1,000 units gives us 154 million. Don't you think the other program's going to die?
I don't know. I don't know how deep the pockets are, or how big the pot of money is.
You were at yesterday's meeting. You think we have $154 million annually?
I can't answer that question. I didn't watch all of the finance.
I will send you the date of the budget meeting.
Okay.
You're welcome to attend. Come to council on that. Questions from my colleague, Councillor DiCiano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Daryl, for coming back in. I want to be polite with respect to your responses to us, but there's a vagueness to some of the questions my colleagues are asking, which I think you know the answers to, and for some reason it's coming out pretty vague. I'll tell you that, well, let me ask you a question. And you've said that the industry between rental and purpose-built condos are different, and they are. Does a developer pay HST when he or she sells a condo unit?
I don't know. None of my members are in the condo business. We're purpose-built rental.
Okay, so I'll tell you that the answer is yes.
We do pay. Apartments have to pay taxes when they're built, but they're exempt for principal residences.
That's right. So any condo over $400,000, there's massive amounts of HST straight off the bottom line from a developer's profit.
Okay.
You, as someone building a rental unit, don't pay that HST. It's a flow-through for you. So instead of it being something that the development community has to pay, it's not a flow-through. For you folks, it's a flow-through. So you're looking at millions and millions and millions of dollars you don't have to pay because it's a flow-through.
No, we do pay on construction. And the other thing is, rent...
And you get it back.
No, rent on the income side is
Right.
tax-free. All the expenses incurred in
Well, it's
operating the building...
depreciated. It's not tax-free. It's deferred through capital cost allowance. But anyways, yes.
All our outbound costs are taxable.
Right.
So we have all these stranded tax credits that we have nothing. It's supposed to wash out,
Right.
but they don't because rents don't come with tax.
Right.
It's an add-on. So we're stranded. We actually lose money in that.
So if your business model loses money, how is it possible that 27,500 rental units were proposed in the last quarter in the city?
Yeah, there's always 10 to 20,000 in the pipeline. Maybe this is a little higher.
But yesterday you showed us 1,100 a year.
This is the same chart, and this is the city's data. I didn't make this up. I mean, if we go back to the, I bring the other one because I know you don't trust my numbers. So
It's an understatement.
This is cut and paste from the city's planning department. The top chart was generated in April of 2017. That's the last 5 years of completions of purpose-built rental in the city of Toronto. 6,300 over 5 years. And this is, I think the planning department will come out with an update in April of 2018.
Okay.
So, and the sheet that I had is a combination of city planning, and at the bottom I've cited that CMHC provided the data from 1997 to 2007.
Okay, so let's go back to yesterday's comment with respect to your associate who is getting a 4% return on an investment and the land cost is zero. How does someone then in your industry, if they don't have land, make it work?
Most of the projects that go forward, not all of them, but most
Right.
of them are with land at zero, infill, or they've anticipated really high rents.
Sorry, most of them are with what?
They've thrown in the land at zero, infill projects.
Well, infill means they own the land?
Yeah, this is building on surplus land that exists around their other apartment buildings.
Right. So why wouldn't they sell that land if they're giving it away at zero to themselves? Like, it just makes zero sense to me.
Right. So
And why have I had in my ward numerous developers who have come and proposed rental buildings on land that they do not own?
now is the right time to start looking at rental. The interest rates are low. They've been low for a long time.
Right.
Rents on a per square foot basis are for the higher
Right.
end are basically doable at this point.
Right.
It's a combination of those things.
Right, so
People are
you
starting
just
to
said
kick
it.
the tires.
The industry is changing, the market is changing. So in the last 2 to 3 years, it's become a really good business model to bring rental to the city. It's become very profitable, has it not? Isn't that why so many people are now coming out of the woodwork, irrespective of these rent controls, and saying, we're going to build more rental? Are they doing it because they just have nothing to do, or are they doing it because they want to make money at it?
Well, they're doing it because that's what they do. The lining up of lowest interest rates and what they can get per square foot on rent are very important. But the discussion I've had with my members is if the DCs double, or any other things that are prescriptive such as this, change the pro forma, they're going to have to walk away. And that's what Howie showed you yesterday. And that is a project where both projects are land at zero. So anything that changes that, as he showed yesterday, will
Okay,
generate
so
nothing.
just one more question. How does someone, such as myself, how can I buy a condo and afford to rent it out, and I bought it at market, which meant someone had to buy the land, someone had to pay the development charge, they had to do all that stuff. I buy the condo, I rent it out, but you can't do the same thing, except unless your land is free. How the hell does that work?
Well, you know, the numbers show it doesn't work. It's not working. The pro forma,
Okay, all my questions.
Let me just summarize it this way. If we could make money doing it, we would have been doing it consistently for the last 40 years. This table that I showed you is the last 20 years of nothing. So if it was as profitable as you say, how come we haven't built any?
Thank you, Daryl. I don't see any other questions. Thank you for coming.
No, but the truth is, we don't build them because they don't turn any profit.
Members,
Rich, we do it because we want to give back.
I think that if you really want to understand it, I think the message you came here for, just Daryl, was you don't want to be included in the legislation.
We think there's a better way for an opt-in and without jeopardizing whatever few we built. Yeah.
And the other discussions, I think, are other discussions. Janice King.
Hello. Janice couldn't make it today, so she asked if I could speak on her behalf. My name is Darlene King.
You're related.
Yes, actually, she's my sister.
You're helping your sister out.
Yes, I'm helping my sister. She just sort of gave me this morning, and I'm like, okay, here I am.
We'll change it to the clerks over here.
All right, sorry.
Help your sister out. Go ahead.
Yes, she felt it was important for her deputation to be heard. She couldn't get out of something today, so I said that I would happily do it for her because she feels very passionate. She's a housing worker here in Toronto, and I'm a community worker here in Toronto myself. So I'm going to read what she wrote. I am here today to object to the proposed inclusionary zoning regulation by the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing. As you know, there is a housing crisis. I would like to look at what some of the regulations the province proposes. One regulation is more than 5% affordable housing units in developments of 20 units or more, 10% in high transit areas. My concern is how this will work. So according to this regulation, can developers go as low as 1%? Why is this regulation in place when everyone knows there is a housing crisis and it is the worst time in history to look for affordable housing? A minimum would be 10 or 30% higher. The next regulation does not protect affordability in new rental developments. This is what I don't understand. Why? There are those people who can't even afford a mortgage to buy a condo, and you are limiting the new regulations to only condos. The next regulation limits affordability period from 20 to 30 years. Why is there a cap? Is affordable housing going to decrease after 30 years? Affordable housing has to be permanent. The last regulation, municipalities have to compensate for 40% of the costs of making the affordable units. If this is implemented, would the City of Toronto be in collusion with developers to keep the number of new affordable units as low as possible, to keep the costs low? Why would the Ontario government implement this type of cheap inclusionary zoning? And why is the city at their mercy? Just like Parkdale, the city agreed with the developers to build a luxury condo for the sake of growth. Parkdale was once a last refuge for people with very low incomes. I've seen the changes. I see these expensive shops opening up. It's funny how the richest people get the most beautiful places in Toronto. They get a view of the lake, of all the places to build. Why not displace low to very low income people from this area? It's what works, right? All of these new developments being built in Toronto are excluding individuals on low to very low income. Individuals have to be very creative when it comes to finding housing. Take, for example, someone living on ODSP. They get $489 for rent, so they need to look for a room that costs $489. Of course, this is impossible. Reality is that rooms now cost $800. The next step for someone to finding housing maybe is to try and find assistance through the Toronto Transitional Housing Allowance Program of $400. So in combination with their rent, they can afford to rent a place for $849, which seems reasonable. Now factor in the rental housing market. Let's look at an example of an ad for housing on the internet. 850 all included, hydro, gas, heat, water, high speed internet. If you're paying all cash in advance for 4 months, then we will give 5% discount. If you pay 6 months with cash in advance, then 7% off. Prefer. One single person, short-term or long-term is fine. You won't be disappointed. Minimum 6 months up to 1 year if you need short-term. Price will be different, $30 key deposit. This is just one of the many ads that create barriers for low-income earners to obtain housing. And to look at a unit in an apartment building, some property management companies require you to submit a $2,400 deposit for first and last month's rent. ODSP or OW does not give money for a rental application deposit. On top of the rent, you might also have to pay an apartment insurance of $23 a month. On top of this, you might have to pay hydro, around $43 a month. So to sum up the cost to rent, $1,200 rent, $23 apartment insurance, $43 hydro, for a total of $1,266 for someone who receives $850 from ODSP and the TTHAP program. ODSP and OW does not pay for rental applications up front. Landlords are not willing to rent to a person who has to receive checks from 2 different sources for a single person.
I'm going to ask you to wrap up, ma'am.
Okay.
10 seconds.
And if a person wants to share to get creative in finding housing, then maybe they can find another person to live with. Imagine asking a landlord to rent to you when there is going to be 4 different sources of funding. Not all housing requires money up front, but I predict the above scenario spending out to landlords who own houses.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Okay.
Are there any questions of the deputant from councillors? No. Okay, ma'am, thank you very much for your deputation today. Next speaker is Chad Ham from BNS Developments. Thank you, Chad. Welcome. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Justin, it's great seeing you again. Let me know if you want to hit the CrossFit over the weekend. Yes, my name is Chad K. Hammond. I'm the CEO, COO, the BTO, as well as the GTO of BNS Development Corp. Look, unlike a lot of you left-leaning politicians and people in the audience, I just like to say, as someone who works in development and the building industry, that I am in full support of this policy being put forward by my good friend Kathleen Wind. I mean, it's pretty classic, isn't it? It's pure Liberal Party. Just enough progressive content to appease the beating hearts, but utterly toothless to affect any kind of meaningful change. Don't even get me started on the cunning of putting this out just before the holiday season when no one in the public or media would have been paying attention. And so, to Ms. Wynne and your wily cabal, I do salute you. Now, brass tacks. I'm going to say some things here that a lot of the boys in my business don't want aired in public. But frankly, I'm tired of saying one thing in the club over a bottle of goose, burning $100 bills, than having to eat humble pie when I come and talk to people like you. So here's the truth, ladies and gentlemen. We, in the development industry, run this province. We run this town. And there ain't nothing you can do about it. You are looking at a hot and sexy juggernaut of capital whose engine runs on building condos. Now, either you can get on this pulsating locomotive, or you can get pulverized by it into a filthy little pile of pinko commie excrement. I mean, what are you people doing? You want to curb what's happening in this great city? Whenever I put up a tower, or my brothers over at Lifetime, Lamb, Omni, Urban Capital, Tridel, Concord, ADEX, Great Gulf, that neighborhood changes from a slimy little larva into like a really sexy butterfly with like a great boob job. Take this little rat hovel of Parkdale, for instance. Filled with bums, druggies, ethnics, dirt, hippies, and artists, or the great counselor, Giorgio Mammoliti.
Sir, I'm going to stop you for a second. If you can just stick to the topic of what we're talking about today, and that's inclusionary zoning. I'm going to ask you to really focus on staying on topic, please. Thank you.
Because let's be honest, this whole song and dance of 5% exclusionary zoning won't change jack in this city. It's a meaningless gesture given the need. People are literally dying on the streets, and we're talking about reducing condos to the average median price of $700,000 over 80% of the population could never afford. I mean, what kind of dog and pony show were you indulging in? Because look, the new Canadian dream in this city is about working hard, making money, so you don't have to live around people that make you feel uncomfortable and icky. I think Martin Luther King said it perfectly when he declared, "I look forward to the day when people will be judged not on their condo facing the lake or not, but rather on the content and diversification of their investment portfolio." Thank you.
Sir, there's some questions for you.
It's more just a statement on everyone's going to wonder what was on that page. Everyone is going to wonder what was on that page.
Well, it was from B&S Developments.
From B&S Developments. Sorry, I guess.
Okay, let's move on.
As you're chairing, I think on behalf of all the parties, he seemed to have named there as developers, and we know how many of them work with the city and are very respectful. I would suggest that those that are listening here do not ascertain that that individual, I'm hesitant to use the word gentleman, actually represented many of those organizations which most of us know here, such as Tridel or Concord or others, who are wonderfully respected within their communities and do work in a cooperative manner with the city, although they may not always agree upon what the density should be of a project. They are nothing like the individual there. So I just point a privilege on their behalf because they shouldn't be included in someone who talks in that matter.
Thank you, Chair. And I certainly think everyone here echoes those comments. Councillor Fillion, do you have a comment?
Just that I appreciated the satire.
It was good.
Yeah, it was well done.
Yeah.
You'll always wonder what was on that page. You just came on to Georgia.
Oh, we should have cut him off.
Okay. Let's begin back on the topic of the day, and we're going to go with Sophia Jaworski, if I've said that correctly. Sophia, welcome. You've got 5 minutes, and you can start anytime.
Thank you so much for including me in this public meeting. I recognize that this is a unique opportunity to depute. It's encouraging that the city's hands are not tied and that there are those out there who are willing to reckon with provincial policy that is not written with the average person's ability to survive in mind. We need to think critically about development language, such as the person who just spoke. He makes it seem as though this policy should be written by a developer. We need dialogue and not to be treated with condescension. The housing crisis will not be solved by building condos that do not directly incorporate unique community needs. There is no doubt this is a city-wide housing crisis, but there's also an intensified housing crisis in my neighborhood. It has come to my awareness that a councillor has mentioned 10,000 people might be displaced from Parkdale. I'm sure we can all agree that this is unacceptable as a number. It's a housing crisis when a condo was built at King and Dufferin in a neighborhood with 0 affordable units included. It's a neighborhood housing crisis when people are paying $700 a month rent and when they move out, landlords are charging $1,900 a month. 20% of the population in Toronto has an income below Statistics Canada's low income measure after tax. In my neighborhood, this is much higher. And so this lends credence to a lot of the discussions today around needed flexibility in this policy. Deeply affordable housing means those living on shelter allowance rates can afford housing price, those on fixed incomes, those who make minimum wage. Inclusiveness and equitable opportunity to housing creates social infrastructure. This is shown in places like the Vancouver Downtown East Side development plan, where they are creating density over time via creation of new social housing units, secured market rental housing, and new affordable home ownership in concert. Canada is falling behind the rest of the world. Toronto needs to invest in housing security. Inclusionary zoning has the opportunity to set the tone for what deeply affordable housing means, and this needs to mean actually being inclusive, not metaphorically. The current proposal is not inclusive. As a friend of mine said, the development industry Grinch's heart needs to grow a few times. The industry is an adversarial because they are prioritizing profits over people. Development profit needs to be sacrificed in order to solve a housing crisis. Development pays more in the long run by not investing now. The city's response to the province mentions defining which local needs are adaptable and responsive. I say if you want to be equitable and needs-based, then listen to the needs in research that has already been done. Canada's Mortgage and Housing Commission suggests housing shouldn't constitute more than 30% of a person's monthly income. In Toronto, individuals are spending 72% of pre-tax income on owning housing, according to a study by Rate Hub. And the Canadian Rental Index finds that 43% of renter households in Toronto are spending more than 30% of income on rent, and 22% are spending more than 50% of income on rent. But when you focus on the lowest income quarter, people who need the city's help the most, there is a structural income gap exacerbating by housing inaffordability of up to $20,000 additional income needed per year in the lowest income just to afford rental housing. This is unacceptable. Therefore, I ask City Councillors to not approve the province's proposal as it rests. No cap on percentage of affordable housing, minimum 50% and 20% in high transit areas. No taxpayers subsidizing developers. Affordable units need to include rentals. Revise the condo-only rule to include developments under 20 units. A significant proportion of new housing is occurring here. Working together does not mean development profits. Inclusionary zoning means including everyone. Inclusionary zoning means including those who have the right to remain in the city they want to live in and to not get pushed out. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions, Councillor Campbell?
So you said, sorry, one of your recommendations was to throw out the percentages. What was the next one you had? It was you were reading your recommendations at the very quickly.
Right. Sorry. I was trying to keep with the time limit.
Those were the most important parts of your message, I thought. So I want to get
that. Well,
You said no to the percentages. For example, it says 5% in all other areas, 10% of residential gross floor in high transit areas, and then your next one.
Well, I had suggested no caps, but a minimum 20% in high transit areas.
Minimum 20, okay.
Yeah, because this is easily demonstrable across.
And that was followed by what?
Just no taxpayers subsidizing developers. So that I'm arguing with the city against the 40% required right now.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Sorry, another question. You're arguing. I'm over here. Sorry, we have questions. I'm not. I'm right over here.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
You're looking left. You're looking right. I tend to fall in the center of the spectrum.
Right.
You're arguing against the province requiring the city to pay 40% or the city paying 40%?
My argument would be against the province requiring the city to pay 40%.
Current programs allow us to do offsets, such as deferral of certain costs to provide the unit as affordable if it's purchased until it's sold as an at market, or a very lengthy term if it's a rental. Mm-hmm. You're not opposed to that, or are you, of us doing some type of financial assistance to bring?
No, I'm not opposed to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jeremy Wither. You're not also from BS Developments like Chad was?
No, I'm not going to be able to follow that.
I looked online. The closest I could get to the face of the individual that was there, and the Chatham name was the picture of a dog. That was the closest I found here. There wasn't any other in Toronto anywhere, from BS Developments in particular. B&S, but B&S, yes, Developments. So please, you've got your 5 minutes.
All right, thanks for organizing this section. Like many of us here, I'm disappointed in our province for having taken so long to legalize inclusionary zoning. We're many years behind cities on this continent that face comparable crises of affordability, and we've had a lot of time to make up for. The price of an average house in Toronto has risen more than twice as fast as the average income for over 2 decades. Today, my generation feels much less secure about our future in this city, and many of us who'd like to raise a family here feel less comfortable about the prospect. Last year, almost half of the tenants living in Toronto put more than a third of their income towards rent. A growing portion are spending more than half. This is dangerous for our social fabric and bad for our economy. Personally, I want to be working towards a city in which our real wages grow at the same pace as our productivity and level of education, and I want these wages to increasingly go towards supporting creative new community projects, farmers markets, local artists, enterprises I believe in. Instead, our city has, on the whole, been moving towards an increasingly shallow and exclusionary economy, which permits an enormous and growing amount of our livelihoods to be sucked up into property speculation. And as the price of shelter goes up year after year, we find our elected representatives with little more than a rubber stamp to defend us. Just this November, I was here at City Hall with a delegation of residents from Parkdale who, after being extensively consulted, declared we were collectively horrified with the proposal to erect a 700-unit luxury condominium in our backyard. It's clear as day these units will not serve the vast majority of our neighborhood and will lead to a ripple effect of increasing vulnerability for most of us. And so we requested that you would demand a substantial number of these units would be set at a price within reach of the average Parkdale resident. What we heard from you was pretty devastating. And that was that your hands were tied, and if you made anything close to that request, it would be likely denied by the OMB. You took turns decrying the anti-democratic nature of that situation, and you took turns pledging to us that you would work with us to fight to change it. So now the province drafts legislation that appears to offer you some powers, but reading over the draft, I'm sure I was not alone in feeling that I was reading regulations that had been written by someone who had either never in their life studied examples of effective inclusionary zoning, or someone who was a developer. The whole tone and content of this document is not framed around empowering municipalities to resist rising unaffordability. It's explicitly dedicated to restricting their ability to do so. The nub of those so-called inclusionary regulations is they expressly forbid municipalities from asking for more than 5% of the units being developed to be affordable. The sole exception being 10% limit optional in areas that are very profitable to develop on because large amounts of public invested in transit infrastructure exist there. So across North America, scanning this, it's standard practice for inclusionary zoning to guarantee around 15 to 30% of units set aside as affordable. Considering how far out of whack our income to price of shelter ratio has been allowed to grow, I think 5% is way too low. And let's all be clear about this, we need to define affordable units to be 30% of someone's income going towards their shelter. And that's a ratio that the CMHC and the province claim to agree on, and it seems reasonable to demand that the affordable units live up to this definition. Another concern many of us have is that while virtually all the inclusionary zoning regulations in North America ask the developer to pay out of their own profits, this draft zoning shifts 40% of the costs onto municipalities themselves, which is baffling to me, and I think you should fight for the right to request the developers pay in full for all the units. I believe we should also demand that inclusionary zoning apply to any development with 10 or more units. This is common practice across North America for inclusionary zoning, and for good reason. Many of our neighborhoods experiencing affordability crises seldom get any development with more than 20 units, and yet they still need the tools to fight for affordability. So we should reject the minimum of 20 units proposed by the province. Finally, it should be stated explicitly you should not have to forego your use of Section 37 to use inclusionary zoning. This forces you to choose between maintaining local infrastructure and maintaining affordability. I recommend you reject this impossible trade-off and demand the right to use both tools simultaneously when you see fit. Frankly, our councillors have very little power at present to make our city more affordable, and this draft legislation hardly changes that. I do think now is the time to force the issue and initiate a loud campaign to give municipalities more power to rein in the price of shelter. For many in the city, this draft legislation mandates 95% of units developed will be unaffordable, and that's a pretty spineless start. I hope you'll take part in making that loud and clear.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Jeremy, is there any questions from committee members? Well, we hear you loud and clear, and thanks for coming in. Okay, next deputy is Joshua Barnt. Is Joshua here today?
Jeff. No, it's Joshua.
Joshua. Did I pronounce your last name correct?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Joshua, you got 5 minutes. You can start anytime. Welcome here today.
So, I guess I'll start off by just trying to comment on my support for particular recommendations and then a few requests for revisions. Recommendation 4 should definitely oppose the cap. However, I would recommend that there be a push up on the requested minimum, a potential discussion on a minimum. from a community perspective, I think we would expect something more like 15, but I understand there's constraints, and I'd leave that to experts of the city to respond to. On recommendation 2, inclusionary zoning must impact all residential developments, inclusive of ownership and rental projects. There is a need for net new affordable ownership and affordable rental units to keep our communities inclusive. The proposed regulations inadvertently discriminate against Ontarians in need of affordable housing who are either ineligible or do not want homeownership as an option. And then one last comment on a recommendation in the staff report. Recommendation 8 on the provision of off-site units and a limitation on 50% of the units, only 50% of those off-site units being inclusionary zoning related. I think that from the perspective of community nonprofit sector, this would make it very hard to produce specific types of housing that would target higher needs tenants and specific target groups, and to potentially get the advantages that the city needs in terms of meeting the need for supportive housing and other specific types of housing. So to empower the nonprofit sector to participate in the provision of this housing, I think that really needs to be revised. But in general, thank you so much for your hard work on the staff report from the Toronto staff. I was actually very proud that we have such smart people working at the city to read it. And then I'd like to spend the rest of my time just talking about why this is so important. And I put this slide up because you have this cool technology. But really it's about will Toronto be an inclusive city? My name is Joshua Barnt, as I said before. I work for a community organization called the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust, which is very interested in the issue of an inclusive city, a diverse city, and an affordable city. The development industry spoke today, but I'd like to just assert that the development industry is changing our city, and it is not doing that in a way that is providing housing to all Torontonians. I grew up in Parkdale, and I'm now 32. Like many other millennials, I do not see a path to ownership. Of all of my friends, all of my friends who grew up in Parkdale, only 2 have been able to reach the goal of home ownership, that dream. So many of my friends are now considering leaving the city. It's sort of this really disappointing, upsetting, and saddening trend of people considering leaving the city because they cannot find affordable housing that meets their needs. Furthermore, in South Parkdale, where 90% of residents are renters, working class and middle class renters alike are continuously struggling to hold on to their housing. The sad reality of most renters in the city is that if we lose our current apartments and the rent controls that are linked to our leases, we will likely not find rents we can afford within our communities. So we are faced with the question of, do we stay in Toronto? Do we stay in our communities? The idea of inclusionary zoning is promising and a promising part of the solution to the affordable housing crisis. But to maintain an inclusive city and mixed income communities, as Toronto has historically been known for, a portion of net new units have to be affordable. It is concerning that the proposed regulation seems to bind the city in providing an inclusive planning framework that serves all residents. Many of my fellow Parkdale residents spoke about our horrific experience trying to engage the city process around a development application at Dufferin and King, where 703 luxury condominium units were proposed with not one affordable unit. It was interesting to have councillors agree with our analysis that we have a need in Toronto for affordable units, and there's a need for more inclusive planning decisions, but that your hands were tied by provincial policy. It seems to me that the inclusionary zoning was potentially a light at the end of the tunnel, where the city might have a tool to be able to make inclusive planning decisions. However, the planning proposal, as we currently read in the regulation, doesn't seem to meet this to accomplish this. So, while the staff report is wonderful, and I thank the staff for it, I want to actually sincerely request that the city councillors, and the mayor take a more concerted effort to engage the province to facilitate a redrafting of these regulations. In its current form, this policy will bind the city from implementing the inclusive planning policy and decisions that residents want and need. So I just want to request in a public meeting that everyone here in this room consider other ways other than just this letter to push the mark on this issue, because it's so important. It's going to impact the future of the city. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there questions? I don't see any. Thank you very much, Joshua, for coming. I have Brian Eng. Brian? And Brian is the last speaker that I have.
Yeah, hi. My name is Brian Eng. Some of you will have seen me sitting in this chair before. 10 years ago, I started working for the Wellesley Institute, and a couple of weeks after I was hired, I was handed a bunch of folders and told to organize a forum on inclusionary housing. And I've been studying this and have been advocating for it ever since that time, and was really glad to see the province finally come up with a plan which has been completely derailed by the regulations. And I fully support the city's attempts to basically say, come on, you guys, give us the power to do what we need to do based on our local conditions. That's clearly the takeaway from everything that we have come to understand about inclusionary zoning in the United States in particular. I want to just quickly, I wasn't actually going to speak until I heard one of our friends from the development industry quote the Urban Land Institute study. And I want to say, we read the same studies as those guys too. And one of the realities of what I hear constantly from the development industry is that they cherry pick what they want you to hear about what they think about the programs in the United States. Yes, New York has a voluntary program that has incentives. It's also proved to be ineffective, which is why there's now a mandatory program without incentives, right? That was the way that they've gone with that. Gave you a law, stated that, jurisdictions will need to provide development incentives and a list of direct subsidies, direct bonuses, tax abatements, reduced parking incentives. But he neglected to give you the last line of that paragraph, which is, each incentive has strengths and limitations that derive from the local real estate market. Okay, so you may or may not need it, and as a matter of fact, to quote the conclusion of this report, it says, in very strong development environments, in brackets, substantial amounts of new construction and rehabilitation, steady rent and price growth, and low vacancy rates, sound like any municipality we know? IZ policies can yield development of new workforce housing units without subsidy or other development incentive from the local jurisdiction. This is the same report that they quote. I would encourage you to read this report. There's tons of good things about how to do pro formas, how land costs affect various things. Nobody's ever said that these affordable units might not, under certain circumstances, actually be provided to the market below the cost. That's not the question. The question is, overall, is the development sustainable? Is there enough surplus? Let's not talk profit, because we don't want to use that word. Is there enough surplus in the other units to cover the fact that the affordable units are being potentially sold below cost? The attempt to do the 40-60 split is an attempt to make sure that there's, that everything is made whole, that there's no loss as a result of doing this. So, basically that's the way we're going. And to go back to what Joy said to you guys earlier, there's hundreds of jurisdictions that can be looked at. And, we don't claim that all of them are as effective as any other. And there's no cookie cutter. And there are some that are doing well and some that aren't. And if we look at best practices, what are the ones that are doing well? How do they compare to Toronto in terms of their development regimes and things like that? I think we can come up with something. But the province needs to give the municipality the capacities to do that. And it'll be different in Toronto than it will be in Mississauga or Hamilton or Ottawa. And to try to sort of say that there's this kind of framework that can be done just doesn't make any sense to me at all. So I think that, Sean started off with what you guys need to do, which is to even be more aggressive about saying, give us the power. Stop treating us like children who don't know what we're doing with our building blocks, right? We're smart people. As somebody else said, we're smart people. We know how to do this, and we know how to work with the development industry to make sure that it can work.
I need you to wrap up.
So that's basically all I need to say.
Thank you, Brian. Are there any questions, Brian? So, Brian, have you had a chance to read the report that we have in front of us today?
I have.
Are you satisfied with the recommendations as our response to the province, or would you make any other?
I don't think I would make any other. I basically, I quite agree. I mean, I have been on, until recently I was on the board of the Social Planning Toronto. So I've been through the process at Social Planning Toronto that sort of resulted in what Sean had to say here, first thing. And I think the main takeaway I have from what Sean had to say and what we have talked about is just, be more positive about your capacities to do this and really be very aggressive about, I think the direction you're moving in and all of the recommendations is exactly, because basically what you're saying is, don't do this to us, let us figure it out, right? And in some cases, you just perhaps need to be a little bit more assertive than that, and call on the community as well. When you start going to Queen's Park and things like that around this, call on the community of people who support, support the municipality and the community being able to do this, being able to figure out how to do it, that there isn't any need to do this. It's completely out of line. The states in the United States don't prescribe to the municipalities how they're going to do inclusionary zoning. They just give them the power to do so.
Well, they don't prescribe every development application or have the chance to do that either.
Yeah, exactly.
So other second question I would ask you is, I feel if the committee supports these recommendations, one of the issues I'm considering is asking then that council send these recommendations off to the mayors and chairs of all the surrounding municipalities across the province and ask them to support them. If we do that, is it something that you and your folks would encourage those organizations to support as well? Because a joint response from all the municipalities of a similar nature might very well finally get the ear and the thoughts at the province change.
Absolutely. The Social Planning Toronto has been working with our partners throughout the province to try to get, we have, I think, about 60 or 70 various kinds of housing-related organizations that have now signed on to a letter which basically says all of these things. This morning there was an op-ed piece in the Toronto Star. I think that Councillor Perks was one of the co-authors of that. I think those kinds of things are absolutely the thing to do. The regional planning commissioners of Ontario have consistently called for inclusionary zoning. If they can, if you can get them to make a joint statement along with their mayors and councils, I think it would go a long way to convincing the province that they have to reconsider these regulations and provide municipalities with the capacity to do what they need to do in order to get, lots of good affordable housing and long-term, the New York City program is perpetual. The 2, 3, 4, 5 generations down the road, as long as those buildings are standing, they're going to be affordable. I like the open doors policy, except it's got a time limit to it. All we're doing is we're transferring the affordability crisis to the next generation. That's maybe good for, it might be good for the young people who are living in my neighborhood, that there's going to be that affordable housing, but their children are not going to be able to afford the same homes that their parents are in.
Okay, I think we've heard that message and appreciate that. Councillor Barlow, also has some questions, right?
Just a question as well. So will you be sending a response, deputations? I mean, when the legislation came out, a lot of us went down and we did personal deputations. We submitted as well from the city. So you'll be...
As far as I know, there isn't a personal deputation process to this.
But there's a
we will be submitting a set of recommendations based on the joint letter that we're circulating right now. I think the deadline to sign on is today or tomorrow, and then we'll be submitting that recommendation to the province.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming. I do not have any other deputant on the list, so we will come back now. Before we go to questions of staff, is it preferable that the staff review quickly each of the recommendations they have, and then we see if there's any further questions after that? Because you're okay with them all the way there? Are there any questions of staff that you wish? No problem at all, Councillor Barlow. You can ask all the questions you want in 5 minutes.
It's just something, I've had lots of conversations with staff about this, but this one I didn't have an opportunity to ask because I just remembered now. So our large site policy has a requirement of 20%, right, of housing. How would this impact something like this?
So through the chair, the official plan large site policy is currently in place. So unless that policy was removed from the official plan, that would continue to apply to new developments.
Okay. So if let's say, they wouldn't change anything and with a maximum of 5%, that we could still continue with that one at 20% on the large sites?
Yes, that's a possibility.
Okay.
Sure. Councillor Ticiano.
Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Councillor Perks.
Aside from the recommendations that the city is making for its own purposes to the province, would it be more beneficial if the province put out an inclusionary zoning policy that took care of the province, but we had our own within the City of Toronto Act? Would it give us more flexibility? And should it be a one-size-fits-all solution?
Through the chair, that would be one approach, but the province has issued Bill 7, which has received royal assent. It just hasn't been proclaimed. So I think starting from scratch and going back to the City of Toronto Act would delay the process. The bill itself, we don't have a concern with. It's the regulation that causes great concern.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Perks, question.
Thank you. I just wanted to, and I apologize if this is dragging you into the messy world of politics.
Not in this building, please. No politics in this building.
Well, I'm trying to, acknowledge staff's independence. The first deputant we had, Mr. Mahar, said that a provincial spokesperson in conversation said to him that the City of Toronto had advocated that there be a cap on the percentage of affordable housing. Has the City of Toronto or any representative of the City of Toronto, to your knowledge, ever said that to the province of Ontario?
Through the chair, no.
Oh, Mr.
Councillor Perks, the conversation with the province, as best as I can describe it to you, was to have the regulation to reflect the city's own practices. The city's own practices with respect to affordability periods starts at 20 years. There was never any conversation about capping it, but providing it so that it complemented, the regulation would complement what we already do.
I see. So anyone who's making a claim that the City of Toronto ever advocated for a cap is misstating the facts.
These were the staff involved, and it was never brought up.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to clear that one up.
So, Sean, there's been a number of suggestions here today as well as to ways that the process could be improved. Property taxes, longer periods of affordability, et cetera. Would you recommend, or would our housing division, or planning division as well recommend we look further at any of those? Yeah, I don't want to convolute the issue too much of what we asked for, but there were people that came with suggestions to us.
Mr. Chair, can I
No, let me get it from staff, please. When you leave us and become staff, that's fine. Let me just find out from Sean what he'd like.
So, Councillor, you have in front of you our best advice, which is that the regulation should provide flexibility and discretion for the municipality. We're running a number of current housing affordability programs. We have certain policies. In the context of the province coming back and giving a regulation to the city that we could work with, we could then revisit and look at what else we might do and how we might align programs we deliver. But you're getting our best advice in this report.
Okay, now the financial impact of the recommendations that are here is up to $154 million annually. So if these regulations went into effect, how could you manage both programs that we have now that you run, the Affordable Housing Office programs, and still try to do inclusionary zoning?
Well, Councillor, I would say to you that even if they brought these regulations in, we need more than 10% affordable housing in the city, and I would argue that we should use everything possible, including what we do. The challenge with this particular regulation, though, is that you're boxed in, if you will, in agreements potentially that involve a lot of luxury housing. And one of the standards in programs that we run is that we have modesty standards, if you will, where we agree and incentivize the development industry, both the nonprofit and the private and the cooperative side. But in this particular program, you would be forced into at least 50% of the units in buildings that are luxury. And you would be forced to pay a component to actually buy those inclusionary units. I'm not sure that's the best value for the public dollar.
And where or what in the city, like, are we currently achieving under our current policies? 5%, 10%, 20%? What are we achieving when we go out and negotiate with a developer?
The city's open door program specifically requires a minimum of 20% of the building to be affordable.
And we're getting that?
We are getting that.
And where do we have policies for 20% affordable?
So through the official plan policies, we have a large site policy that requires 20% of the increased units be affordable housing. We also have in a number of different secondary plans, for instance, the Central Waterfront Secondary Plan requires 20% affordable rental housing, and we've been achieving that on a consistent basis.
So we have policies that are working. We were looking for policies to be scribed into legislation that would support that and enhance that. And did we get something here that helps or hinders?
Through the chair to the chair. In terms of Bill 7, we've achieved some achievements in the fact that the official plan policies for inclusionary housing are not appealable. The challenge is the implementing regulation has a number of concerns as outlined in the report.
Oh, that's so politically correct, isn't it? Okay, I don't have any other questions. Were there anyone with questions of staff? Okay, so now we have a report in front of us with recommendations I'd be happy to move, which is the staff recommendations. And I think all of us are of the same mind that this is a big step backwards. It's okay, I'll just deal with it. This is a huge step backwards, that all the good work that we thought we were going to get isn't going to be there, that the recommendations that are in place, at least from my perspective, are a hindrance to be able to move forward. You look at things like development charges and the city contributing them instead of getting them back, as we do know, doesn't work. We were debating that yesterday and can't afford to continually give away development charges on major projects where now we can recoup them, to give away parks and the funding for parks, which in many areas of the city we're trying to have policies in place to enhance the parks. And this goes backwards because the more people that move into a community, the more that you need those parks, and this just says to give it up. That talks about parking standards, which are always an issue of debate anyways with a development, but we've been flexible and actually built a building with no parking. And yet in some areas of the city, in the suburban areas, the parking is required because people don't have the same access to public transit, so they want a spot for their car for weekends and weekdays. And giving that up really is a penalty on the person that may end up in that unit later. The funding model here doesn't work. And in my opinion, it was put together to not work and for something that can't succeed. And most of all, where I don't agree with our colleagues from the apartment industry, I say absolutely apartment buildings should include affordable housing. The issue is the way that we assist in that and can assist and have been successful in assisting. And for those people from the industry that come forward and say, you can't do it, and say to you as a municipality, you don't know how to do it. Well, Councillor DiCiano and I sat on our development company, and Councillor Barlow is joining there now on the new one, and we have done it. We have been able to achieve great developments with wonderful community benefits of all types, getting communities to support them and getting very good returns out of those sites and financial returns to provide annual dividends back to the city. And at the same time, we have achieved affordable housing in those units, both rental and ownership units, both of them there, and been extremely successful. Over 700 units in the last year and a half. That's phenomenal. And the average cost to the development corporation is running about $20,000 a unit on these projects. That's what we've averaged for our cost per unit, plus the subsidies and the assistance the city gives. So when someone comes and says, you don't know what you're doing, city, you're just a government, what do you know? We're not just a government. Everyone in this room here that's elected on council has to deal with the same residents on every development application and every one of the problems that they bring up. Parking or transportation, site issues, all that, we have to deal with that. But then we have to deal with the policies that you have to have in place to intensify the city, and we've done a pretty good job of that. Even under the current regime where we don't have the indecision and we're appealed, and the province has failed on that to the point where their system is so broken they had to finally fix it. But we also develop properties because we have a real estate and development corporation, and we've done that too. So don't tell us at the provincial level it can't be done, and don't tell us from the development industry, whether it's purpose-built for sale or rental, it can't be done. So we have 100 rental units going in up at Wilson and Wilson Heights in Councillor Pasternak's area. Subsidized, affordable units. At the same time, 100 ownership units. It can be done. It should be done. And we are doing it. Now we need our provincial partners to make sure that the industry understands that and they come forward to do it as well with us in partnership in a manner that we can deliver what residents of the city need. They need affordable housing to meet the standards that people have of lower incomes, and we need affordable housing and affordable rental to meet the middle standard as well. All of those are needed to make this a great city, and I think this council is unanimous on that. And we really need someone to listen to us at the provincial government level and stop messing up what is a great thing and help us make it better, because we've shown that we could do that. That's all I have to say. Is there any other speakers? Councillor Perks?
So I think today was an important moment in the history of the City of Toronto's work on the issue of housing. We have never before called a special meeting like this, told staff, you know, I know you're busy, but you have 3 days, write a report, and given the public an opportunity to come down and respond to a piece of provincial legislation. It's something we just never do. And I think, as a number of the deputants said, it's the kind of thing we need to do and do more of. This is a moment when everyone in Toronto who pays any attention to the issues about how we are building the city and what the future of the city will be and who will be in our city has come together and said, there's a crisis. We've had some of the leadership of the affordable housing movement in the City of Toronto come forward and basically read us the Riot Act. This is a crisis. This is something you must do. We've taken the extraordinary step Councillor Bailao has as our Deputy Mayor of writing directly to the province on an issue like this. I mean, that takes tremendous political courage to step out ahead of council coming to a decision and saying, no, in my role as Deputy Mayor, I need to speak out. Councillor Layton, it was mentioned, organized an op-ed being written with signatories from Toronto, Ottawa, Hamilton, London, and Kingston. This is becoming a province-wide movement to point out just how terrible this regulatory framework that the province of Ontario has done. And it's not going to stop here. It's not going to stop here because there's a structural problem that we need to address, and address sharply and address aggressively, as we were asked to do. Right now, and I'm very sorry to the members of the industry who came here, but right now, we are sitting on a gold rush. There is literally nowhere in North America where people who are investing in land to make a profit are doing better. This is the place where, if you are a private investor in building housing, this is the place on the whole continent where you are making the most money. Anyone who comes and tells me it's too difficult and I can't, don't constrain me, I mean, no. No, just no. We have literally established a financial system through CMHC, which I believe currently underwrites $500 billion in mortgages for the banks. Land development system where the Ontario Municipal Board and the rest of the provincial regulatory regime says, open for business. And a banking system that is, you know, the envy of the world in terms of its stability. I get developers coming in from all over the world, and they're not telling me, oh, it's way too tough in Ontario. They're just saying, I'd like an extra 10 stories because it's so hot here. This is where I want to make money. So the effort doesn't stop here. The partnership that emerged, you know, the Chair Shiner saying we have to have this special meeting. Our Deputy Mayor saying, no, I have to speak out on this. Members of Council, not just from Toronto, but from around the city, housing activists, local community activists, that partnership has lots more work to do. Because if we don't do this work, not just on this inclusionary zoning piece, but getting back to a place where public governments invest in creating housing that's affordable again, until we get that partnership going, we are not building a city that people can live in. We are building a city that some people can live in, and that's not okay.
Thank you. Councillor Bailao.
Thank you. I want to start by thanking staff and thanking all the advocates that are here and thanking the committee as well. I mean, this discussion has started a few years ago, maybe 2015-16, after 14 votes that Toronto Council had asked the province to have inclusionary zoning done. This government passed the legislation, and staff and I met with the majority of council. That's what actually led to the submission that was done in 2016 that you also have as part of your report, and that honestly, we're maintaining that position. We're very consistent. If one thing that the province can say is that we've been very consistent since this conversation started in 2016. We've been saying the same thing over and over again and offering our assistance to the province over and over again to show them how it works, how it is applied, to bring in people from the sector, to bring in people that understand performance, to create a legislation that can be implemented and produce units. And I think the sector has been very consistent as well. They've been there since the beginning. The province had very good discussions at the beginning of this process. We brought people from the industry, the sector. Many of the people are here. We're at some of these discussions. I think we were hopeful that something more productive was going to come out of these discussions. So I think there's a level of disappointment in everybody that has been involved for the last 2 years in these conversations, and that's why at the same time there's the frustration, the disappointment is felt in some of these conversations because the need is so great for this legislation. The need is so great to create a legislation that we all agree. Nobody wants to hinder the development industry because we need them to produce industry. We need them to produce units. But we know, we've seen, we've done the studies, we know that there's space to have these units produced. There's space in their performance to be able to work with us without these 40% payments on the part of the city. We know that it can be done. We've seen the numbers. It can be done. And we've showed them. We've showed them to the province that it can be done. So I'm hoping that with the strong statement from Council, with the work that we continue to do with the advocacy community, that we can have the regulations and a legislation that will allow us to do the work that still needs to be done. And that's what I was trying to tell the chair of this committee. What is in front of us is just our input for the regulations. We still have a lot, once this is done, we still have a lot of work to do to bring down those regulations to our local market in the city. And it's still work to be done. I have full confidence in our staff because they're getting ready for that. They've been getting ready. They're doing the studies, and we're all going to have to do this work together as council. But I think we're well headed into that direction if we are given the right package that allows us the flexibility to respond to the different needs and different circumstances of the housing market in the city and eventually with the market. We don't want to be running up to the province every time the market changes and we need to adapt to it. We need to make sure that we can work with our partners, the nonprofit sector, the housing sector, to respond to the needs, to always be able to find that sweet spot that Joy talked about, that sweet spot that we get as many affordable units, as many complete communities as possible, and they continue to thrive, and we continue to thrive and build the city that makes sense, which is a city full of complete communities.
Okay, I don't see any other speakers. We have the staff recommendation here before we vote on it, and the meeting will end. I think from all of us on the committee and from all the members of council, a very special thanks to the staff of the city, both in housing and in planning, that have done a phenomenal job of getting this report out in front of us and all the work it takes to circulate it internally to get it right. But getting that done and getting it here so we can actually transmit to council a report with the justification and the recommendations that are required and take this position in time to be able to meet the deadlines that the province has set. So this is not one person or one department, it's cross-section, and all of you. I think it's planning, legal, I know gets involved, affordable housing just gets involved. Really, from all of us, our sincere thanks to you for doing a wonderful job so we can do our part of the work here. We just wanted to express that, and then we have the motion, which is a staff recommendations. All in favor? Absolutely, a recorded vote. All in favor?
All those in favor, Councillor Fillion, Councillor Bailão, Councillor Campbell, Councillor Ticiano, Chair Shiner, and Councillor Perks. That's unanimous.
And can we show in the minutes that the staff would have liked to put their hands up too? The item is carried unanimously. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you all very much for coming.